Hello friends, I'm glad you are here tonight. Before we begin, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you listening from, and what time is it for you right now? I find it fascinating to imagine how people across the world tune in at different hours. Some resting before sleep, some waking early in the morning, and some simply seeking calm in the middle of a busy day. Whatever the case, I invite you to sit back, close your eyes if you wish, and let me take you into a long story, a journey through time, deep into the days when biblical history was still unfolding, when people walked through deserts, planted in valleys, and gathered around fires to share tales that would shape civilizations. Now, when you hear the phrase biblical history, your mind might jump to towering figures like Moses or David, or to dramatic events like the Great Flood or the Fall of Jericho. But tonight, I want us to slow down, to step away from the moments that are often told with great drama, and instead linger in the quieter details. What was daily life like for the people who lived in those lands thousands of years ago? How did they wake in the morning? What did they eat? How did they pass the long, hot afternoons? And how did they find rest in the evening? These details might seem small, but they reveal the rhythm of human existence in a time when survival was not taken for granted. Imagine the ancient villages scattered across the hills of Canaan, clusters of mud brick houses with flat roofs, where families might sleep on summer nights to catch a breeze. The air carried the faint scent of olive oil pressed in nearby groves, and the sound of goats bleating as shepherd boys led them down toward streams. Life was simple yet demanding. A man might rise before the sun crested the horizon, taking a wooden staff into his hand as he guided his flock toward grazing lands. His wife would remain behind, kneeling by a stone hearth, grinding barley into flour with a heavy stone, her arms moving rhythmically, the sound of grinding filling the house like a soft heartbeat. Food, of course, was central to daily survival, and it reveals much about this world. Bread was the staple, often coarse and dark, baked into flat rounds on hot stones. Lentils, onions, and cucumbers were common, and olives provided both fruit and oil. Milk from goats and sheep was turned into soft cheeses, and in the right season, dates and figs offered sweetness. Meat was rare, usually reserved for festivals or sacrifices, so on most days the diet was modest but sustaining. The act of eating was more than nourishment. It was fellowship, a reminder that life itself was a gift sustained by the Creator. Children in these villages had duties as well. A boy of 7 might already help herd sheep or carry water from the well, while girls often assisted their mothers with weaving or preparing food. Yet, even in the midst of labor, there was room for play. Archaeologists have uncovered small clay figurines and carved pieces of bone that suggest children fashioned toys of their own. They may have raced one another barefoot through dusty paths, laughing as they chased after a hoop rolled with a stick, or sat in the shade stringing beads. The Bible rarely pauses to describe such moments, but history reminds us that even in times of struggle, childhood always found its place. Religion, of course, wove through every part of life. People rose with prayers and ended the day with thanks, believing that blessings or calamities alike came from God. The rhythms of the week revolved around rest on the Sabbath, while the larger seasons followed agricultural festivals. Picture the Feast of Tabernacles. Families leaving their homes to live in temporary shelters, weaving branches into huts under the open sky, recalling the wilderness journey of their ancestors. At night, the lamps would flicker, and songs might echo through the valley, carrying stories of deliverance, reminding everyone, from the eldest elder to the smallest child, that they were part of something larger, a people with a destiny. The landscape shaped life as much as faith did. In the hill country, terrace slopes allowed farmers to grow vines and olive trees. In the lowlands, wheat and barley stretched in golden waves across the fields. Water was precious, and cisterns carved into the rock collected rain to sustain entire villages. Sometimes, a spring would turn a valley into a lush garden, and families would gather under fig trees to share their meals. At other times, droughts turned the land harsh, the earth cracked beneath their feet, and prayers for rain filled the air with desperation. Survival was always uncertain, and this uncertainty bound people tightly together, for community was the only safeguard against famine, invasion, or loss. At night, After the labor of the day, families would gather around small lamps fueled with olive oil. Shadows flickered against the mud brick walls, and the elder of the household might begin to tell a story. These stories were not mere entertainment. They carried wisdom, memory, and identity. Perhaps he would recount the journey of Abraham leaving Ur, trusting in God's promise. Or perhaps he would remind his children of Joseph, who had risen from slavery to power in Egypt, saving his family in time of famine. These stories were woven with hope, teaching children that their struggles were part of something greater, that their hardships had meaning. But not all evenings were solemn. Sometimes, after a day of toil, laughter filled the rooms. Neighbors might gather, bringing dried figs or roasted grains, sharing not only food but companionship. Music, too, played a role. Shepherds carried flutes made from reeds, and young men might beat rhythms on small drums. Even in a world of scarcity, joy found its way into life, reminding them that even amidst hardship, moments of beauty were always near. And as we sit here in our modern time, thinking about those ancient days, it's worth remembering that these men and women were not so different from us. They too worried about tomorrow. They too rejoiced at a good harvest. They too longed for peace, and they too wondered what their children's future might hold. The details of their lives may feel distant, but the emotions, the hope, the fear, the laughter, the sorrow, remain deeply familiar. This is where we begin our journey. Not with battles or kings, but with ordinary life in the biblical world. A world where bread was needed each morning, where flocks grazed on hillsides, where stories shaped identity, and where faith infused every action. In the stillness of that world, we find a mirror to our own, and perhaps, as we walk further into their history, we might discover not only who they were, but also who we are. If you close your eyes for a moment and picture yourself stepping into one of those ancient villages, you will notice that beyond the sounds of animals and the fragrance of bread, life was defined by relationships. The family was the foundation of society, and everything revolved around it. Marriages were not just unions of two people. They were agreements that linked households, strengthened ties, and secured futures. In the biblical world, love as we know it today was not always the first consideration in a marriage, though affection often grew over time. Instead, parents often arranged marriages, ensuring their children were connected to families of good standing, with land or flocks that could sustain them. A young girl, often still in her early teens, might be betrothed, with her family offering a dowry, while the groom's household provided a bride price, an acknowledgement of her value and the joining of the two clans. Weddings themselves were moments of celebration, bursts of joy that punctuated the rhythm of daily survival. Imagine the music of flutes and tambourines echoing through narrow village streets, neighbors gathering, children running between the adults as the bride, veiled and adorned, was led to her husband's home. Oil lamps would burn brightly, and tables would be set with bread, wine, fruits, and roasted meats if the family could afford them. Laughter and dancing filled the night, for marriage was not simply a private affair. It was a communal event, reminding everyone that the continuation of life and faith was assured through the next generation. Once married, a woman's role was immense. She bore children, managed the household, prepared food, spun wool, and wove garments. She was the keeper of domestic order, the one who made sure that the rhythm of daily life did not falter. Men, for their part, tilled the land, shepherded flocks, built homes, and defended the community when danger arose. Yet, despite these divisions, survival required cooperation. A wife might join in harvesting fields, and a husband might repair the loom. Their lives intertwined like the threads of cloth stretched across a loom, each strand fragile alone but strong when woven together. Travel in those days was a different kind of challenge. Roads were dusty, unpaved paths winding across hills and valleys. Donkeys carried loads of grain, pottery, and oil, their hooves kicking up clouds of earth, while travelers shielded themselves from the relentless sun. Journeys were slow, for one could walk perhaps 20 miles in a day, and rest was required often. Caravans offered some safety, for bandits lurked on lonely paths, but even in groups, every journey carried risk. Yet travel was essential for trade-bound communities together. Salt, spices, fine cloth, and metal goods moved along ancient routes, bringing with them not only wealth but stories and knowledge. Markets were at the heart of this movement. Picture a marketplace in a walled town. Narrow alleys filled with the voices of traders calling out their goods, baskets of figs stacked high, jars of honey glistening in the sun, bolts of dyed cloth unfurled to tempt buyers. A man might barter a sack of barley for a skin of oil, while a woman carefully inspected a bundle of herbs for healing. These markets were more than places of exchange. They were meeting grounds, spaces where people from different tribes and backgrounds encountered one another. Here, news spread as quickly as goods, and rumors traveled faster than caravans. Entertainment and rest also had their place in this world, though perhaps not in the form we know today. Storytelling remained the most cherished form of leisure, with tales drawn from ancestral memory and sacred tradition. Music, too, carried people through their days. Shepherds played flutes as they tended their flocks, while women sang rhythmic songs as they pounded grain or drew water from the well. Dancing broke out at weddings and festivals, the beat of drums guiding the steps of men and women alike. Games, though simple, existed, stones tossed in patterns, or small animal bones used like dice, offering both amusement and a way to pass the quiet hours of dusk. Yet life was never without hardship. Illness struck often, and without the remedies of modern medicine, healing depended on herbs, rest, and prayer. A simple fever could take a life, and childbirth was fraught with danger. Families relied on midwives, women whose experience guided them through the most perilous moments of labor. Death was not distant. It was part of the rhythm of existence, shaping the way people valued each day. Funerals were solemn, with wailing voices and rituals of burial in caves or beneath the earth, as families gathered to honor the memory of those who had gone. Still, there was resilience in this way of life. The people of the biblical lands knew hardship, but they also knew how to endure. They found meaning in rituals, hope in festivals, and strength in their faith. Festivals, in particular, offered reprieve from toil. During Passover, families prepared lamb and bitter herbs, remembering the deliverance from Egypt, their homes filled with the scent of roasted meat and unleavened bread. During the harvest festivals, joy poured out into the streets, songs rose toward the heavens, and gratitude replaced anxiety, if only for a time. Children listened closely to every story told at these gatherings, their eyes wide as elders recited the ancient words of prophets and patriarchs. For them, these were not distant tales. They were the foundation of their identity. To grow up in the biblical world was to be surrounded by a constant reminder that history and faith were inseparable. Each generation was tasked with remembering, with retelling, with ensuring that the lessons of the past would not vanish. And in the quiet of night, after weddings had ended, markets had closed, and fires had burned low, the stars revealed themselves in the vast desert sky. Shepherds watched from the hills as constellations glittered like jewels, their silence broken only by the bleating of sheep. Villagers lay on rooftops, gazing upward, whispering prayers or dreams for tomorrow. The biblical world was full of struggle, but it was also full of wonder. To look at the night sky then was the same as now, a reminder that above all human toil, the heavens stretched endlessly, mysterious and eternal. As our journey continues through the world of the Bible, imagine walking not only through small villages scattered across hillsides, but also into the larger towns that became centers of culture, trade, and worship. Life in these towns pulsed with energy that contrasted sharply with the quiet of the countryside. Narrow streets twisted between stone houses, and at the heart of each settlement stood a marketplace where voices echoed, smells mingled, and life converged. These towns were not large by modern standards, but for the people of that age, they represented the height of social and spiritual life. Houses in these towns were built with function in mind. Mud bricks, sun-dried and sturdy, formed walls thick enough to keep the heat out during scorching days and hold warmth during cold nights. The roofs were flat, often coated with clay, supported by wooden beams and reeds. Families used these rooftops as living spaces, drying figs or stretching linen to bleach under the sun. In some homes, animals were kept in the lower levels, their warmth rising to the family quarters above during cool seasons. The interiors were modest, low wooden stools, woven mats, clay jars for storing oil and grain. A single oil lamp, its flame fed by olive oil, cast flickering light across the room at night. In towns, you would also find workshops where craftsmen shaped the world with their hands. Potters molded clay into jars and bowls, turning their wheels with practiced rhythm. Blacksmiths hammered iron into tools and weapons, sparks flying in dimly lit forges. Weavers worked at looms, creating cloth from wool dyed with natural pigments, producing garments for both daily wear and special occasions. Each trade carried respect, for survival depended on these skills. And though wealth was unevenly spread, every occupation had its dignity, because every task contributed to the fabric of life. Water defined the rhythm of these communities. Wells and cisterns were essential, gathering rainwater during the short wet season, sustaining the population through the long months of dryness. The well was often more than a practical necessity. It was a place of meeting, of conversation, of encounters that shaped destinies. Think of the story of Abraham's servant finding a bride for Isaac at a well, or Jacob meeting Rachel as she watered her father's flock. In these moments, the well became a symbol of life, continuity, and divine providence. Above all, though, the temple or place of worship held the community together. In some towns it might have been a modest shrine. In Jerusalem it rose to a glory beyond imagination. The Temple of Solomon, a place that shimmered with gold and cedar, where the Ark of the Covenant once rested. For ordinary people, this temple was more than architecture. It was the dwelling place of the divine on earth, the link between heaven and humanity. Pilgrims traveled from afar to offer sacrifices, to present offerings of grain, oil, or doves, and to feel, if only for a moment, the nearness of God. The role of priests was central in this spiritual world. Dressed in garments of linen, sometimes adorned with precious stones and embroidery, they performed the rituals that bound people to their faith. Sacrifices of animals were carried out with solemn precision, each act symbolizing repentance, thanksgiving, or dedication. Incense rose in fragrant clouds, filling the sanctuary with the scent of cedar and resin, while chants echoed, reminding worshippers of the holiness of the moment. Priests were not only mediators between God and the people, they were guardians of tradition, interpreters of law, teachers of morality. But spiritual life was not confined to the temple. In homes, fathers taught their children the Shema, the great declaration of faith. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Mothers sang psalms while grinding grain, their voices blending worship into daily labor. Every meal began with a blessing, and even the act of sowing seeds or tending flocks was understood as service to God. This integration of the sacred with the ordinary created a worldview where nothing was meaningless, where every moment was touched with divine significance. Festivals brought towns to life in ways that few other events could. The Feast of Weeks, or Shavuot, celebrated the first fruits of harvest, and pilgrims would stream into Jerusalem with baskets of grain and produce, lifting their voices in gratitude. During the Feast of Tabernacles, entire families constructed booths from branches and palm fronds, living in them for days to recall the wilderness journey of their ancestors. These gatherings filled the air with joy, music, and sacrifice, but they also reinforced a sense of unity. No matter where someone came from, hill village, coastal town, or desert outpost, they were all bound together by covenant and memory. The towns themselves reflected this diversity. Some were fortified with walls of stone, their gates tall and imposing, guarded by soldiers with spears and shields. These gates were not merely defensive, they were also centers of public life. Elders gathered there to judge disputes, to settle agreements, to witness contracts. Merchants displayed their goods at the gates, catching the attention of travelers entering or leaving the city. The gate was a place of justice, trade, and community, a threshold where the private world of home met the larger world of society. For those who lived within these walls, daily life carried both comfort and strain. Safety was greater than in the countryside, but so too were taxes and demands from rulers. Kings required tribute, grain, wine, oil, or labor for building projects. Soldiers patrolled the streets, and scribes recorded accounts, ensuring that every household gave its due. Yet for many, the presence of walls offered peace of mind, protection against raiders or wild beasts that threatened the villages beyond. Children in towns grew up in a world of constant activity. They watched craftsmen at work, learned to read from scribes if their family could afford it, and played in the courtyards among neighbors. Girls were taught to spin and weave, preparing for the roles expected of them, while boys might train in the ways of farming, trade, or even the priesthood if their lineage allowed. Education was not widespread, but wisdom was passed down orally, from parent to child, from elder to youth. To know the stories of the past was considered as important as knowing how to sow or reap, for memory itself was survival. As night fell in the towns, the energy did not vanish. Oil lamps glowed in doorways, and the murmur of voices carried through narrow streets. From rooftops, people looked toward the stars, their silhouettes framed against the glow of distant fires. Priests, scribes, soldiers, farmers, women grinding grain, children laughing. All were bound together in the tapestry of life that stretched across centuries. And so, when we think of biblical towns, we must not picture them as lifeless ruins of stone, but as living, breathing communities where faith and labor intertwined, where every wall carried the echo of laughter and lament, where every street held footsteps of generations who believed they were part of a story larger than themselves. If you were to wander through the lanes of a biblical town at midday, you would hear not only the voices of merchants and the cries of animals, but also the steady rhythm of tools shaping raw material into something purposeful. Crafts were everywhere, and each craft revealed both necessity and creativity. Though survival required bread, oil, and water, people were not content with bare function. They sought beauty, detail, and expression, even in the simplest of objects, for within them was the desire to reflect the order and artistry of creation itself. Take pottery, for example. Every household needed jars for storing grain, amphorae for oil and wine, and small bowls for daily meals. Yet each potter added his own touch. Some pressed simple geometric patterns into the clay, others painted designs in dark slips before firing. Handles were curved with care, rims smoothed until the lips could drink without sharpness. The potter's workshop was both a place of utility and art. A wheel spun under steady hands, the clay rising and falling, narrowing into a jar, widening into a bowl. Children might gather at the edge, mesmerized by the transformation of shapeless earth into a vessel that would carry food or water, a reminder of how human hands echo the act of divine creation. Metalwork, too, carried both beauty and weight. Blacksmiths shaped iron into plowshares and sickles, vital for agriculture. But they also forged jewelry, daggers, and ornamental pieces. Bronze, hammered and polished, became mirrors that reflected a blurred but cherished image. Gold and silver, rare and precious, were worked into rings and necklaces, often reserved for the wealthy or for religious offerings. Some of these items were passed down for generations, carrying not only material value but memory, the touch of ancestors preserved in the worn edges of a bracelet or the dents of a drinking cup. Textiles held another realm of artistry. Women spun wool and flax into threads, dyed them with colors drawn from plants, minerals, and insects. Indigo blues, deep crimson from madder root, purples extracted painstakingly from shellfish. All spoke of patience and skill. The loom became not only a tool of necessity but a canvas. Patterns emerged, stripes and borders woven into garments that reflected identity, region, and family. A simple tunic could be plain, yet a festival cloak might be richly colored, embroidered with symbols of vines, stars, or geometric shapes that held meaning. Clothes marked status, yes, but they also told stories of heritage and community. Adornment was not absent from daily life. Women braided their hair, sometimes weaving small beads or ribbons into the strands. Men oiled their beards, shaping them neatly as a sign of dignity. Both men and women might wear simple rings or pendants, some bearing carved seals that marked identity in contracts. Perfumes made from myrrh, frankincense, or other resins gave fragrance to the body, especially during festivals or weddings. These details remind us that even in times of struggle, people long to present themselves with care, to bring beauty into a world that could be harsh and unforgiving. Music, too, was everywhere. The shepherd's flute, carved from a reed, carried its gentle tune across valleys. Harps and lyres, strung with gut strings, filled homes and sanctuaries alike with their resonant sound. Drums and timbrels marked rhythms at weddings and dances, their beats stirring joy in the hearts of listeners. Music was woven into worship, lifting prayers beyond words, and it accompanied labor, making the grinding of grain or the treading of grapes less wearisome. Psalms, sung by families and choirs alike, bound melody with meaning, creating moments where the human voice reached upward, seeking communion with the divine. Art did not always take grand forms. It was present in small carvings etched into bone or wood, in geometric decorations on storage jars, in painted walls of wealthier homes where colors reflected both imagination and prosperity. These acts of artistry carried no separation between sacred and secular. A carved design on a lamp might be simple ornament, but it also expressed gratitude for light. A woven pattern in cloth was both decoration and remembrance of order. Beauty was not an indulgence but a way of aligning life with the harmony of creation. Children absorbed this sense of creativity from their earliest years. They watched their mothers weave, their fathers carve or hammer, and they imitated with scraps of clay or wood. Small clay animals have been found in archaeological digs, perhaps toys, perhaps teaching tools. A child shaping a tiny donkey or sheep was learning not only about play but about the creatures that sustained their family. In this way, art passed naturally from one generation to the next, embedded in the rhythm of daily existence. The temple itself, of course, represented the pinnacle of artistic devotion. Cedar beams carved with intricate designs, gold overlaid on altars, embroidered curtains dyed with blue, purple, and scarlet, all spoke of craftsmanship dedicated to God. Every artisan who contributed saw their work as sacred. Their skills were not only gifts of survival but offerings of worship. To shape wood, metal, or cloth for the temple was to participate in something eternal, to leave behind a legacy of devotion in physical form. But creativity was not limited to objects. Words themselves became art in the hands of scribes. They copied sacred texts with precision, each letter carefully shaped, each scroll reflecting hours of labor. To write was to preserve memory, to bind the present with the past, to ensure that the words of law, prophecy, and poetry would survive beyond the lives of those who heard them. Literacy was rare, but where it existed, it carried immense weight, for the written word was seen not only as record but as revelation. And when night came after the forges had cooled, after the looms had gone quiet, after the potter's wheel had slowed to stillness, people gathered again to rest. But even then, the fruits of their craft surrounded them. Lamps glowing with crafted light, garments woven with care, jars filled with oil, flutes leaning against the wall, waiting for another melody. Their world was built not only on necessity but on expression, and it was this mixture that gave life its fullness. Survival kept them alive, but beauty gave them meaning. When we think of life in biblical times, it is easy to imagine endless labor. Sowing, harvesting, tending animals, building, fetching water, grinding grain. Yet woven into this fabric of work were moments of joy, laughter, and celebration. People were not merely surviving. They were living, and life required moments where the heart could rest, where families and neighbors could gather in delight. Festivals, games, and simple pleasures gave rhythm to the year, balancing hardship with joy, toil with laughter. Festivals stood at the very center of communal joy. They were not quiet occasions, but living experiences that involved the entire community. Picture the Feast of Passover, when families came together to remember the night their ancestors were spared in Egypt. Each household roasted a lamb, shared unleavened bread, and drank wine, while retelling the story of deliverance so that even the youngest child could carry the memory forward. It was a meal, yes, but more than that. It was storytelling, worship, and community bound together in taste, sound, and ritual. The Feast of Tabernacles, or Sukkot, brought a very different kind of joy. Families left their houses and built temporary shelters from branches, palm fronds, and woven mats, living in them for a week beneath the open sky. Imagine children lying awake at night inside these makeshift booths, peeking through the gaps to count the stars, while parents reminded them of the wanderings of Israel in the wilderness. Songs rose around campfires, neighbors visited one another's shelters, and the entire town turned into a festival of memory and thanksgiving. Weddings, too, were among the most joyous celebrations. They were not quiet ceremonies but vibrant events that could last for days. Families decorated streets with garlands of flowers and greenery, musicians filled the air with flutes and drums, and dancers circled in rhythm, their steps practiced and full of energy. The bride, often adorned with jewelry and veils, processed through the streets, accompanied by laughter, music, and the light of oil lamps carried by friends. Food overflowed at wedding feasts: bread, roasted meats, figs, honey, wine, and everyone ate until they were full. To witness a wedding was to witness not just the joining of two people but the strengthening of the community itself, for every marriage meant continuity, children, and the future of the people. But not all joy came from great festivals. Daily life held smaller pleasures, games and entertainments that lightened the burden of work. Children played with clay figurines shaped like animals or soldiers, rolling them in the dust or setting them in lines as though preparing for a parade. They played chasing games in the courtyards, laughter echoing against the stone walls. Some spun small discs carved from bone or stone, toys simple yet enduring. For them, the world was a place of imagination, and even a stick or a pebble could become a sword, a crown, or a tool in their play. Adults also enjoyed games, though theirs were often more strategic. Board games carved into stone slabs have been found in ancient ruins, grids and patterns suggesting competitions of wit and chance. Pebbles or carved pieces were moved along the lines, perhaps in ways similar to modern checkers or backgammon. These games were played at city gates, in homes, or during leisure after long days of labor. They were not frivolous. They sharpened the mind, fostered friendship, and sometimes offered a brief escape from the seriousness of survival. Music and dance were central to recreation. Dances were not performed alone but in groups, circles, and lines, often accompanied by tambourines and lyres. Women danced at harvests, at victories, at weddings, their movements graceful yet filled with joy. Men joined in with stamping steps, clapping hands, and strong voices. These dances bound people together, creating unity in movement and rhythm. To dance was to express joy with the whole body, to let the burdens of the day fall away in motion. Meals themselves could become celebrations. Even in ordinary times, neighbors might gather for shared meals when work allowed. Bread baked fresh from clay ovens, olives seasoned with herbs, lentil stew simmering with garlic and onions. These foods, simple but flavorful, brought people together. Wine mixed with water softened conversation, and songs accompanied the breaking of bread. Hospitality was not merely kindness. It was obligation, a sacred act. To invite someone to share a meal was to bind them into fellowship, to remind them they were not alone. Storytelling played its role in entertainment, especially at night. Around fires, elders recounted tales of ancestors, of battles fought, of journeys across deserts, of miracles witnessed. Children listened wide-eyed, and adults found reassurance in the repetition of stories that linked them to something greater than themselves. These tales carried moral lessons but also provided delight. The rise and fall of voices, the pauses for suspense, the gestures of hands, all made the stories living events, shaping imagination as much as memory. There were also moments of simple rest, when people did nothing but watch the sky change colors at dusk or listen to the wind pass through olive trees. Shepherds on hillsides played flutes as their flocks settled, while farmers lay on their rooftops at night, gazing at stars in silence. Rest itself was sacred, and the Sabbath commanded it. One day each week when no work was to be done, when labor ceased and joy was found in quietness, worship, and family. On the Sabbath, meals were prepared in advance, lamps lit before sunset, and families gathered to sing psalms, pray, and simply be together. This rhythm of rest and renewal was itself a form of celebration, reminding people that life was more than toil, that rest was as holy as work. Even in times of hardship, joy was not absent. During famines or wars, people still clung to music, to stories, to rituals of togetherness. A simple song sung in the dark, a loaf of bread shared among many, a whispered prayer spoken at night. These acts became celebrations of survival, quiet victories against despair. It was in joy, both great and small, that people found strength to endure, to hope, and to continue. So when we imagine biblical life, we must not see it as only hardship or solemnity. We must see the weddings that lasted for days, the festivals that transformed cities into camps of celebration, the games played in courtyards, the music that filled the air, the laughter of children chasing each other through dust. These moments were the heartbeat of the people, the spaces between labor where life revealed its sweetness. If you look closely at the lives of those who walked the earth in biblical times, you cannot escape the rhythm of agriculture, for it was the backbone of existence. Every season carried its own demand, every month its own task, and the people lived in harmony with cycles of soil, rain, and sun. To understand them, you must picture the land itself. Terraced hillsides, fertile valleys, stretches of wheat and barley swaying under the breeze, vineyards winding up slopes, and olive groves standing like guardians over centuries of cultivation. The land was not merely a backdrop. It was the stage on which all of life unfolded, the partner of every man and woman who sought bread for the table and wine for the cup. The year began with plowing. After the rains softened the earth, oxen were yoked together, their strength guided by a farmer holding a simple wooden plow tipped with iron. Furrows split the soil, and behind them seeds of barley and wheat were cast by hand, falling like scattered hope into the ground. Children sometimes walked beside their fathers, imitating the gesture, tossing small handfuls of seed into furrows as though joining the work of creation itself. The field, bare and brown in the morning, began by afternoon to look like a promise, a place where life was hidden, waiting. Grain was the foundation of their diet, and its growth was a matter of constant concern. Too little rain meant hunger. Too much at the wrong time could ruin the harvest. Farmers watched the skies, read the winds, and prayed fervently, for their survival lay beyond their control. Yet when the rains came in season, the fields transformed. Barley ripened first, its heads heavy and golden, followed by wheat, taller and fuller. By the time of harvest, the land itself seemed to glow, a sea of gold beneath the sun. Harvest was not silent work, but an event of energy and joy. Men cut stalks with sickles, women and children gathered bundles, and the grain was stacked in sheaves across the fields. Songs rose in rhythm with the cutting, voices carrying across the valley, joining labor with melody. When enough was gathered, oxen trampled the stalks on threshing floors, separating grain from chaff, while women winnowed with large baskets, tossing the mixture into the wind so that the breeze carried away the husk and left behind kernels of sustenance. These moments were communal. Neighbors helped one another, for no family could manage alone, and in the helping there was joy. Vineyards offered another story, one of patience and devotion. Vines had to be planted, pruned, guarded against animals, and cared for season after season. They were not quick to yield fruit, but once mature, they became treasures that lasted for generations. The grape harvest was a time of laughter, for workers pressed clusters in large vats, stomping with bare feet as juice flowed into channels. Children delighted in the work, splashing in purple pools, while adults turned the juice into wine, stored in jars to age and sweeten. Wine was not excess but necessity, safer than water at times, central to meals and rituals alike. Each sip carried with it the memory of hillsides, labor, and the gift of land. Olive trees, ancient and steadfast, offered yet another foundation. Their twisted trunks bore fruit for centuries, linking generations through the same branches. The harvest of olives filled baskets, and presses extracted their oil, a substance vital not only for cooking but for lamps, for anointing, and for trade. To light an oil lamp at night was to extend the gift of the olive tree into hours of rest and prayer. To anoint a head with oil was to mark joy, blessing, and health. These trees stood as symbols of endurance, surviving droughts and storms, embodying the resilience of a people who drew strength from their land. Seasonal tasks shaped the calendar. In spring came planting and lambing, when fields awakened and flocks multiplied. Summer brought pruning of vines, weeding of fields, and long days of guarding crops from pests and birds. Autumn held the great harvests. Grains gathered, grapes pressed, olives picked. Winter was quieter but not idle, for it was the time of repairing tools, mending garments, preparing seed, and reflecting by the fire. Life was a circle, turning year after year, each stage bringing both labor and expectation. Agriculture was not only economic but deeply spiritual. The first fruits of harvest were offered to God, carried to the temple in baskets, reminders that abundance was not achieved alone. Festivals like Shavuot and Sukkot revolved around harvest, linking worship with the rhythm of soil. The people understood themselves as stewards, not owners of the land. They saw each harvest as a covenant renewed, a sign that heaven and earth still worked together. When drought struck, prayers filled the air. When rains returned, thanksgiving rose like incense. Their relationship with the land was a relationship with the divine, inseparable and constant. And alongside the grand cycles were the small, daily moments. A farmer kneeling to check a sprouting shoot. A woman grinding barley on a stone, humming softly as flour gathered in the bowl. A shepherd leading goats to pasture, their bells tinkling in the morning light. Children chasing each other between olive trunks while parents pruned branches nearby. These images stitched together the reality of life, a blend of toil and tenderness, effort and delight. Even their tools carried stories. Wooden plows worn smooth by calloused hands, stone sickles with flint blades, woven baskets that carried grain or grapes, clay jars that stored oil and wine. All were made with care, repaired when broken, and passed down through families. A tool was not disposable. It was companion to labor, holding the memory of countless days in field and vineyard. At night, when work was done, farmers often gathered on rooftops, eating simple meals of bread, cheese, olives, and perhaps a little wine. Their bodies ached, but their hearts rested in the knowledge that the land was alive beneath them, fields breathing, vines ripening, trees standing strong. They knew tomorrow would bring new tasks, but tonight they could rest, knowing that the cycles of creation were steady, unbroken, and eternal. So the rhythm of agriculture was not merely labor but life itself. It gave food, it shaped festivals, it bound families, and it connected earth with heaven. Without the fields, vineyards, and groves, there was no community, no worship, no joy. To see their world, you must see the land, brown soil turned by plows, green shoots reaching for the sun, gold fields ready for harvest, purple grapes crushed into joy, silver oil flowing from ancient trees. It was through these gifts that people lived, endured, and gave thanks. When we shift our gaze from the fields of barley and the vineyards heavy with grapes to the hillsides and open plains, we find another story, one quieter yet no less essential, the story of the shepherd. If the farmer lived in rhythm with soil, the shepherd lived in rhythm with living creatures, guiding flocks through pastures, streams, and rocky terrain. To follow the shepherd is to walk away from the crowded marketplace and the clustered homes of stone into a world of open sky, whispering winds, and the endless company of animals. Shepherds rose with the first light of dawn. Before the sun cleared the horizon, their voices were already calling, guiding sheep or goats from makeshift pens built of stones or thorny branches. The animals, restless from the night, pressed against each other until the gate opened, and then they flowed outward like a living river. Their bleating filled the air, mingling with the jingling of bells tied around the necks of certain animals, so the flock could be tracked from a distance. The shepherd moved with a staff in hand, often accompanied by a dog trained to circle and guide, though in some places it was the shepherd alone who bore the responsibility of control. Pastures were not abundant. They had to be sought. The shepherd's day was one of walking, searching for green patches among rocky hills, leading the flock to streams where water trickled clear and cold, then finding shade when the sun grew harsh. The shepherd knew every contour of the land, every hidden spring, every cave that offered shelter. Each path was etched into memory, learned from elders who had walked those same routes decades before. To be a shepherd was not simply to tend sheep, but to know land in a way no map could capture. Meals were simple and often taken in solitude. Bread carried in a pouch, olives wrapped in cloth, a piece of dried fish or cheese. These sustained the shepherd while the flock grazed. Sometimes he lit a small fire, roasting a handful of grain in a pan, or warming milk freshly drawn from goats. The meals were not feasts but enough to nourish body and spirit. And while eating, the shepherd's eyes never fully rested, always watching the flock, scanning for movement at the edge of sight. Dangers were real and constant. Wolves prowled at dusk, lions and bears still roamed in certain regions, and thieves sometimes crept in to steal livestock. The shepherd carried a sling, a weapon of leather straps and stone, which with skill could strike a target at surprising distance. Many shepherds practiced endlessly, sending stones whistling against tree trunks or distant rocks, honing accuracy that could protect both flock and self. The staff, too, was more than a walking stick. It was a tool for guiding, defending, and pulling animals from crevices. To be a shepherd was to be vigilant, alert even in calm, ready to act when threat appeared. Yet alongside the dangers were moments of deep peace. When the sun began to sink, and the flock settled into a hollow or pen for the night, silence spread across the hills. The shepherd lit a fire, its glow flickering against stones, its smoke curling into a sky already filling with stars. Here, with nothing but sheep huddled close and the whisper of wind, the shepherd lifted songs, psalms, prayers, or melodies of his own making. The hills became his sanctuary, the sky his roof, the fire his companion. Many words that later became sacred were first spoken in such solitude, where human voice rose unaccompanied beneath the vastness of creation. Shepherding was often a family tradition. Sons followed fathers, learning to distinguish the sound of each sheep, to mend torn hooves, to recognize when an animal was sick or injured. They learned patience, for flocks moved slowly, and the path of grazing stretched endlessly. They learned courage, for danger demanded swift action. And they learned solitude, for days could pass without meeting another soul except for passing travelers or fellow shepherds. Yet when shepherds met, they exchanged news, shared bread, and often joined flocks for a time, their laughter echoing across the hills as animals mingled together. Life as a shepherd was shaped by the seasons. Spring brought lambs, fragile and unsteady, needing constant care. The air filled with their high-pitched cries as they searched for mother's milk, and shepherds worked tirelessly to protect them. Summer meant long journeys to find water, sometimes leading flocks miles away from home. Autumn offered richer pastures after harvest, when fields left behind by farmers grew patches of green. Winter was harsh, demanding warmth, shelter, and resilience, as cold winds swept across barren hills. Each season left its mark, shaping shepherds into people of endurance and quiet strength. At times, shepherds became witnesses to events others missed. Alone on hills, they saw storms roll in before cities felt the rain. They watched stars blaze with unusual brightness. They listened to the silence of the earth at midnight. Their solitude sharpened their senses, made them attentive to signs and wonders. Perhaps this is why shepherds were often chosen in sacred stories to receive visions or messages, for their lives prepared them to listen, to see what others overlooked. But beyond survival, shepherds found small joys. The bleating of lambs chasing each other through grass, the delight of cool water after hours of heat, the way firelight made stone walls glow at night, some carved flutes from reeds, filling evenings with soft music, notes drifting into darkness where no one heard but the stars. Others told stories to themselves, remembering tales of ancestors, speaking aloud to pass the time. In such moments, solitude transformed into a kind of companionship, where land, animals, and sky became friends. When a day's journey ended and the flock was safe, the shepherd lay upon the earth, cloak pulled tight, eyes lifted to constellations that told time, season, and direction. He measured months by the stars, tracked migrations of birds, read messages in the heavens. His sleep was never deep, for one ear always remained open to sound, yet rest came in fragments, woven into the rhythm of vigilance. This life was not one of ease, but of closeness, to earth, to creatures, and to the divine. So the shepherd's story is not only about guiding sheep. It is about learning the patience of the hills, the vigilance of the night, the endurance of the seasons, and the quiet joy of solitude. It is about meals of bread and olives eaten beneath a sky of countless stars, about fires kindled in silence, about songs rising from lonely places. It is about a life where every step mattered, every sound was listened to, and every day was lived in connection with creation itself. If shepherds carried the solitude of hillsides and farmers lived by the rhythms of soil, then artisans carried the pulse of cities and villages, for their hands shaped the objects that sustained and decorated daily life. To step into the world of the craftsmen of biblical times is to step into spaces filled with sound, with heat, with fragrance of raw materials, and with a constant hum of skill handed down through generations. The potter was perhaps among the most central. Imagine the workshop, a small, shaded space open to the street, where clay rested in heavy lumps, moist and cool to the touch. The potter sat before a wheel, turned by hand or foot, steadying the spinning platform with rhythm gained from years of practice. Clay rose beneath his fingers, coaxed into vessels, jars for storing grain, pitchers for water, bowls for meals, lamps for evening light. Children often gathered nearby, mesmerized by the transformation of formless earth into elegant shapes. The air smelled of wet clay and smoke, for behind the workshop, kilns fired day and night, flames hardening vessels into durability. The process was not swift. Clay had to be dug, mixed with water, kneaded to remove stones, shaped with precision, dried under the sun, and fired carefully. A single crack could ruin hours of work, and so patience was as necessary as skill. Each pot bore the potter's touch, a silent signature of his hand, and though vessels were humble, they carried beauty, often etched with simple lines or painted with earth-colored patterns. Close by, the blacksmith's domain rang with another music. His workshop glowed with heat from the forge, where charcoal fed flames that turned metal red-hot. Sparks leapt as hammers struck iron upon anvil, the rhythm echoing down narrow streets. The smell of smoke mixed with iron filled the air, heavy and sharp. Here were born plow tips that broke the soil, sickles that cut grain, nails that held beams, hinges that swung gates, knives for kitchens, and swords for soldiers. The blacksmith's body bore the mark of his work, arms strong from hammering, face smudged with soot, clothing singed by stray sparks. Apprentices stood nearby, pumping bellows to keep fire alive, learning the patience of heating, the timing of striking, the art of quenching metal in water so that strength was locked into form. Tools were essential to life, and so the blacksmith was indispensable, his craft standing at the edge of both creation and defense. Then there were the masons and stonecutters, whose labor shaped the very landscapes of cities. Their work began in quarries, where massive blocks of limestone or basalt were pried from earth with wedges and chisels, muscles straining under sun. The sound of stone splitting echoed across valleys. These blocks, rough and heavy, were hauled on sledges or carts, dragged by oxen to building sites. There, masons chiseled with precision, smoothing surfaces, shaping corners, fitting stones so tightly that walls stood for centuries. With their hands rose the foundations of homes, the walls of marketplaces, the pillars of temples, the arches of gates. Theirs was not a quiet craft but one of dust and weight, sweat and coordination. Yet through their labor, cities gained permanence, stability, and beauty. To walk streets lined with stone was to walk the memory of their skill, every block carrying evidence of endurance. In quieter corners, the weaver and the dyer brought color and comfort into daily life. Looms made of wood stood in courtyards, threads stretched taut, waiting for the shuttle to pass back and forth. Women often worked these looms, creating cloth from wool or flax, rhythm steady, hands practiced. Patterns grew slowly, strip by strip, transforming thread into garments, blankets, and coverings. The work required attention, for a single mistake could distort the fabric. Dyers added vibrancy, boiling vats of liquid colored with plants, roots, or rare shells that produced deep hues, reds, purples, blues. The smell of dyes was pungent, strong, and lingered in alleys where such work was done. Clothing was not abundant. Every garment carried weight, a labor of hours, sometimes days. Yet woven cloth was also art, decorated with borders, fringes, or designs that spoke of family and tradition. Leatherworkers too held a place of importance. Hides from animals, cleaned and treated, were transformed into sandals for journeys, belts for garments, pouches for carrying grain, or water skins for long travel through dry lands. Their workshops smelled of tanning, an odor sharp and earthy, filling the senses. Stretched hides hung on racks, tools of bone and bronze cut and shaped, and the leatherworkers' fingers bore stains that never fully washed away. Every traveler, every soldier, every shepherd relied on these products, and so the craft was woven into the web of survival. Carpenters filled another essential role. Their world was one of wood, of saws biting through cedar or olive, of chisels smoothing beams, of hammers driving pegs. They shaped doors, tables, chests, yokes for oxen, beams for roofs, frames for carts. In their workshops lay curls of shavings, fragrant and light, covering floors in soft piles. Wood was scarce in some places and valuable. Nothing was wasted. A small offcut might become a spoon, a child's toy, or a simple tool. The carpenter's hands were steady, strong, yet capable of delicate work, carving details into furniture or shaping smooth handles for tools. Their craft built not only houses but also gave shape to the intimate objects of home. And scattered among these were countless other artisans. Bead makers working with glass or stone, perfumers mixing oils and herbs into fragrances that filled markets, scribes bending over parchment with ink and reed pens, recording words that carried memory through generations. Each one, in their small space, contributed to a tapestry of society, each hand leaving a mark invisible at first glance but undeniable when seen as a whole. The soundscape of a city in those days was crafted largely by them. The clatter of hammers, the whistle of grinding stones, the crackle of kilns, the rhythm of looms, the murmur of apprentices learning craft. To walk through a marketplace was to move through an orchestra of creation, where every sound meant survival, sustenance, beauty, and continuity. At the end of the day, artisans like farmers and shepherds returned to simple meals, bread baked earlier in clay ovens, olives, cheese, perhaps dried figs or dates, and, if fortune allowed, a bit of meat or fish. They gathered with families, telling stories of work, of vessels successfully fired, of stones fitted, of cloth completed. Children listened wide-eyed, already tracing in their minds the work they too might one day learn. So the artisans shaped more than objects. They shaped culture itself. Their work was visible in every jar of oil, every stone wall, every robe, every tool. To understand biblical life without them would be to imagine a body without hands. For it was through their skill that daily existence found structure, color, and strength. Their workshops, filled with sound, heat, and fragrance, were the hidden heartbeats of society, echoing through centuries, still speaking through the ruins and relics left behind. If artisans formed the hands of society, shaping tools, garments, and vessels, then the markets were the beating heart, where those objects, along with food, animals, and treasures, moved between people. To step into a biblical marketplace was to step into a realm alive with voices, colors, smells, and constant motion. Streets and squares that by night lay silent turned by morning into rivers of activity, drawing farmers from fields, shepherds from hills, craftsmen from workshops, and travelers from faraway lands. The air was the first thing one noticed. It was heavy with the mingled scents of bread baking in clay ovens, fresh herbs piled high on stalls, spices ground into powder, the sweet stickiness of dates and figs, the sharp tang of vinegar and oils, the unmistakable musk of animals, and the smoke of fires that roasted fish or meat for those who wished to eat on the spot. The marketplace was not merely a place to buy and sell. It was a sensory landscape that imprinted itself upon memory. Voices layered over one another in a kind of music. Merchants called out their goods with persuasive phrases, praising the sweetness of their fruit, the strength of their fabrics, the sharpness of their blades. Buyers replied with counteroffers, bargaining in rhythms as old as civilization itself. Prices were rarely fixed. Haggling was expected, even enjoyed, as much a part of the exchange as the object itself. To agree too quickly was to risk offense, for bargaining carried its own rules of respect. The stalls themselves varied greatly. Farmers laid out baskets of grain, barley and wheat measured into sacks, or jars of honey sealed with wax. Shepherds sold cheese and milk, or lambs and goats tethered to posts, their bleating rising above the noise. Potters displayed rows of vessels, their earthy colors glowing in sunlight, some simple, others adorned with patterns. Weavers spread out bolts of cloth in shades of natural wool or dyed hues, their textures inviting hands to touch. Metalworkers set knives, sickles, and jewelry where light caught their polish. Perfume sellers offered small flasks of oils scented with myrrh, frankincense, or herbs. In one corner, a scribal booth might be found, where contracts were written, letters composed, or scrolls copied for those who could not wield pen themselves. And then there were the spice traders, who carried the aura of distant lands. Their stalls smelled of cinnamon, cumin, coriander, and saffron, scents so powerful they lingered in clothes and skin. These traders often came from afar, their accents and dress marking them as strangers, yet their goods were treasures sought by all. Through such exchanges, the marketplace became not just a local meeting ground but a place where cultures touched, where stories of distant deserts, mountains, and seas reached ears hungry for wonder. Animals were ever present. Chickens fluttered in cages, donkeys brayed as they carried heavy loads, oxen stood tethered, goats bleated, pigeons cooed in wicker baskets. Their presence brought life but also chaos. Sudden noises startled children, hoofs clattered against stone, and the ground often bore signs of their passage. Yet to imagine a marketplace without them would be to strip it of its pulse, for animals were food, transport, labor, and sacrifice, essential to life itself. Money changed hands in the form of small silver or bronze coins, their surfaces stamped with images of rulers or symbols. But barter was just as common, for not everyone carried coin. Grain might be exchanged for cloth, oil for tools, livestock for pottery. Each trade was sealed by spoken agreement, often witnessed by bystanders who acted as informal guarantors. Trust was a kind of invisible currency, and reputation mattered deeply. A merchant known to cheat could find his stall empty of customers, while one known for fairness drew loyalty across years. The marketplace was also a social gathering. News spread here faster than anywhere else. Travelers brought word of distant lands, armies on the move, caravans passing through, or famines striking elsewhere. Elders gathered to discuss disputes. Mothers exchanged advice while children tugged at their garments. Young men and women stole glances at each other across stalls. Friendships were forged and broken in the ebb and flow of conversation. Laughter erupted as musicians played flutes or drums to attract attention, and storytellers spun tales that wove history and myth together. Feasting was part of the day, too. Vendors sold skewers of roasted meat, steaming bowls of lentils, fresh flatbread puffed from clay ovens, figs drizzled with honey, cool cups of diluted wine. Eating while walking among stalls was common, and so the marketplace fed body and spirit alike. Even those with little coin found ways to taste, for generosity often mingled with trade, and a slice of bread or a handful of olives could be pressed into the hands of a child or stranger. And when the sun grew heavy at midday, canopies of woven cloth or palm leaves offered shade, creating patches of cool beneath which people lingered. The market slowed, voices softened, transactions paused, only to rise again as the day cooled toward evening. By dusk, goods were packed, stalls dismantled, and silence slowly returned, broken only by the echoes of what had transpired hours before. Yet the dust stirred by countless footsteps and the lingering scent of spices reminded anyone passing by that the market's life would return with the next sunrise. The marketplace was more than commerce. It was the mirror of society itself. It reflected abundance and scarcity, trust and rivalry, local roots and distant influences. It was where a child first tasted sweet dates, where a farmer measured his worth in bushels of grain, where a traveler felt the pulse of a city, where joy, laughter, anger, and reconciliation mingled in one place. To imagine the biblical world without its markets would be to imagine silence where life should roar, for it was in these crowded, noisy, fragrant spaces that community truly lived. Life in biblical times was measured not only by seasons, work, and markets, but also by the rhythms of festivals and celebrations. Times when the ordinary tasks paused and communities gathered to honor tradition, faith, and the cycles of life itself. These occasions were not brief interruptions. They were vivid, sensory experiences that imprinted themselves into memory. To imagine them is to see streets alive with music, courtyards fragrant with cooking, voices lifted in song, feet moving in dance, and hearts swelling with shared joy. The preparation for a festival began days, sometimes weeks in advance. Homes were cleaned, clay ovens scrubbed, tables swept, garments mended or sewn anew. Ingredients were gathered, grains for bread, honey for sweets, figs and dates, dried fruits, olive oil, herbs for flavor, and wine for toasts and offerings. Families often collaborated across generations, elders guiding younger hands, telling stories of past celebrations, recounting how ancestors had marked the same season centuries before. Preparation itself was a rehearsal, a way to align body and spirit with what was to come. When the day arrived, streets and courtyards overflowed with life. Vendors brought special goods to sell, colored fabrics for new clothes, candles or oil for lamps, decorations fashioned from reeds, palm leaves, or clay. Children ran ahead of parents, sometimes trailing small flags, sometimes carrying simple musical instruments like reeds or clay whistles, learning from playful imitation how to participate in rituals that were both sacred and social. Food was central. Large communal meals were arranged, each dish carrying meaning. Bread was baked in clay ovens, often shaped into symbolic forms, sometimes stamped with patterns representing faith or gratitude. Roasted lamb, slow-cooked in fire pits, filled the air with smoky richness, mingling with fragrances of stewed lentils, beans, and herbs. Fresh fruits were piled high in bowls, nuts cracked for snacks, and honey drizzled over pastries and cakes. Wine was poured generously, sometimes diluted, sometimes sweetened, accompanying songs and prayers. The meals were feasts not only for the body but for the spirit, reminders that life and sustenance were gifts to be celebrated. Music and dance accompanied nearly every festivity. Men and women played flutes, tambourines, drums, and strings made from gut or horsehair. The rhythms were complex, echoing the pulse of work, the heartbeat of the land, the cadence of stories passed down through generations. Dancing often began as structured ritual, then spilled into spontaneous joy, children spinning in circles, adults clapping hands, feet stamping in unison, laughter and song blending into a living tapestry of sound and motion. Certain dances were specific to religious observances, honoring deities or recounting sacred events, while others simply celebrated harvest, abundance, or communal identity. Processions and ritual acts gave structure to the celebrations. Some festivals involved carrying offerings to altars or temples, perhaps first fruits of the harvest, a lamb, or grains pressed into cakes. Participants dressed in their finest, adorned with belts, jewelry, or wreaths of leaves and flowers. Leaders recited prayers or read sacred texts, voices rising above the crowd, creating moments of solemnity amidst the exuberance. Even those not directly participating in the ritual felt its rhythm, its power, for the act united the community under shared meaning. Games and competitions were another layer of celebration. Running races, tossing stones, or testing skills with slings or bows entertained young and old alike, teaching dexterity, courage, and coordination while strengthening bonds among neighbors. Storytelling competitions emerged spontaneously, voices competing to hold the crowd's attention, tales stretching from heroic deeds of ancestors to clever fables about animals and gods. Winners earned not only praise but subtle forms of honor, remembered long after the festival ended. Nightfall did not diminish festivities. Rather, it transformed them. Oil lamps and torches glowed along streets and courtyards, casting shadows that flickered like spirits in the dark. Fires were kindled in central spaces, around which communities gathered to sing, dance, and tell stories. The stars above, vast and ancient, mirrored the lights below, creating a sense of continuity, as if the heavens themselves observed the celebration. Music and laughter could be heard across neighborhoods, blending into a soundscape that lingered in memory long after embers cooled. Some festivals were annual, marking agricultural cycles, planting, harvesting, or seasonal changes. Others commemorated historical events, victories, or deliverances, linking past and present in ritualized remembrance. Still others were spontaneous, celebrations of particular births, marriages, or community milestones, flexible and creative, yet always bound by the recognition of shared life. Each festival reflected society's values, hopes, and continuity, reinforcing bonds among participants while offering respite from daily toil. And even beyond formal rituals, small joys punctuated these gatherings. Children chasing each other with borrowed instruments, a neighbor sharing a piece of honey cake with a stranger, someone improvising a song, an elder telling a joke or parable that drew laughter and reflection alike. Festivals were living, dynamic, unpredictable, full of sensory richness. Tastes, smells, sounds, sights, textures. The ordinary was transformed into extraordinary simply by attention, participation, and shared intent. So the life of celebration was as essential as the life of labor. Festivals and communal joy wove society together, providing rhythm, memory, and meaning. Through food, music, dance, ritual, and shared presence, communities reaffirmed themselves. Each celebration connected earth, human effort, and divine blessing, reminding all participants of their place in a larger, enduring story. These were not mere interruptions to life. They were its high points, crystallized moments where ordinary people became part of something greater, where their labor, their faith, and their joy converged into beauty, wonder, and collective memory. If markets were the heart and festivals the pulse of society, then homes were its soul, quiet spaces where life unfolded in intimacy, rhythm, and routine. To enter a biblical home was to enter a world shaped by necessity, function, and subtle artistry, where every object, corner, and surface had purpose, and every moment, from morning light to midnight darkness, was filled with acts that defined existence. Houses were often constructed of mud bricks, sun-dried and layered carefully to create walls thick enough to keep out heat in summer and cold in winter. Roofs were flat, made of layers of wood, reeds, and clay, sometimes accessible for sleeping in summer nights or drying grains and herbs. Courtyards open to the sky, central spaces where much of life was conducted. Food prepared, water drawn, laundry washed, animals tethered, and conversations held. Rooms were functional, few in number, often dark except for small windows that allowed sun to enter and smoke to leave. Yet within these modest walls, families carved comfort, order, and identity. Furniture was sparse but purposeful. Low benches and stools provided seating, wooden chests stored belongings, shelves held vessels, and simple beds were often mats of straw or wool, laid on raised platforms to keep sleepers from the cold or damp floor. Tables were low, used for meals and work, and cushions or mats softened hard surfaces. Every item was multifunctional. A chest might serve as a seat, a table doubled as a work surface, and mats could be rolled up for storage. Craftsmanship was valued even in simplicity, for handmade objects, shaped with care, carried dignity. Kitchens were centers of activity, often located near courtyards or along walls. Fires were built on clay platforms or in small pits, sometimes with rudimentary chimneys to guide smoke outside. Cooking vessels, clay pots, pans, jars sat ready. Food was prepared over open flames or embers, slowly, deliberately. Bread was baked in small clay ovens, flattened with hands, or pressed with wooden tools. Lentils, beans, or grains simmered in oil and water. Vegetables and herbs were chopped and mixed to flavor dishes. Occasional meat, often roasted on spits or in pits, released aromas that filled the household. Families ate simply but thoughtfully, often communally, with children sharing in the preparation, kneading dough, stirring pots, or fetching water from wells. Water itself was precious and labor-intensive. Carrying it from wells or streams demanded care, often in large clay jars balanced upon shoulders or heads. Water was used not only for drinking but for cooking, washing, and ritual purification. At home, it was stored in jars or cisterns, sometimes covered with cloth or lids, to keep it clean. The sound of water poured into vessels, its splash into basins for washing hands or feet, was a constant undertone to daily life, a reminder of the effort behind sustenance. Lighting at night came from oil lamps or torches, flickering with soft glow that created shifting shadows on walls. Lamps were simple clay vessels, filled with olive oil, a wick immersed and lit to provide warmth and vision. Families gathered near light, reading, mending garments, telling stories, or simply sitting in companionable silence. Darkness was not feared but observed as part of life's rhythm, and the soft illumination of lamps encouraged quiet reflection and conversation. Children's routines intertwined with household labor. From an early age, they learned essential skills. Girls grinding grain or weaving small mats, boys helping fetch water, care for animals, or tending small vegetable plots. Play occurred in the spaces between chores, chasing each other in courtyards, rolling balls made of clay, imitating adults' work, or practicing storytelling. Play was never separate from learning. The two flowed together, teaching responsibility, dexterity, and imagination simultaneously. Storage was essential. Clay jars and baskets preserved grain, oil, and dried foods. Shelves or nooks kept fabrics, utensils, and tools organized. Jars were often sealed with cloth or wax. Grains measured and rotated to prevent spoilage. Herbs and seeds were hung to dry, ensuring supply for cooking and planting. Every household rhythm included attention to preservation, careful counting, and methodical arrangement, for resources were precious and scarcity always possible. Evenings often brought family gatherings. Around small fires or lamps, members ate, spoke, and shared news. Elders recounted stories of ancestors, moral lessons, or events in the surrounding villages. Prayers were said, hands lifted, voices joined, linking each household to divine oversight and communal continuity. Music occasionally arose, soft melodies on small flutes or drums, and laughter threaded through conversations. The intimacy of home created a cocoon where learning, reflection, and connection intertwined. Night sleep was regulated by both environment and routine. Children and adults alike lay on mats, sometimes gathered in communal rooms or on rooftops in summer heat. Blankets, woolen or woven from plant fibers, provided comfort. The night was alive with subtle sounds. Wind rustling through olive trees, distant animals calling, occasional footsteps of neighbors returning home, the murmur of a nearby stream. Yet within homes, a sense of security prevailed, a rhythm of breathing and warmth, the assurance that labor was done, that preparation for the next day awaited, and that life persisted in quiet, resilient continuity. Through homes, one could trace the full spectrum of daily life. Labor, rest, nourishment, learning, play, storytelling, prayer, and reflection. Each object, each corner, each sound contributed to a continuous narrative of existence. Homes were not merely shelters. They were living spaces that held memory, skill, culture, and love. Life inside was intimate, structured, and full of quiet complexity, bridging the practical and the spiritual, the mundane and the meaningful. The domestic world was inseparable from the larger patterns of work, worship, and community. Families existed in rhythm with fields, flocks, artisans, and markets. The lessons learned within homes informed labor outside and vice versa. The household was the first classroom, the first temple, the first community. In the simplicity of clay floors, woven mats, wooden chests, flickering lamps, and shared meals, generations found continuity, resilience, and belonging. Children in biblical times inhabited a world at once familiar and demanding, a world where play, learning, and work intertwined from the earliest years. To follow the life of a child is to glimpse a spectrum of activity and discovery, where imagination met necessity, where the rhythms of the household and community shaped development, and where the foundation for adulthood was laid through experience, observation, and participation. From dawn, children awoke with the household, often before the sun had risen fully, stretching on mats or woven bedding, listening to the soft murmur of family preparing for the day. Girls might help their mothers grind grain, knead dough, fetch water, or sweep courtyards, their small hands learning dexterity and endurance through repetitive tasks. Boys assisted fathers or older brothers with chores, carrying firewood, tending small livestock, helping with gardens, or observing the skills that would one day be expected of them. Yet despite the weight of responsibility, children carved time and space for play, and through play they explored, learned, and expressed joy. Games were inventive, often born from imagination and necessity. Simple objects became instruments of delight. Balls of tightly rolled clay, sticks for mock combat, stones for tossing games, and hoops woven from reeds. Chasing, jumping, balancing, and racing were not only entertainment but training for agility, strength, and coordination. Skills that might later protect a shepherd in the hills or a young man traveling between villages. Storytelling and role-playing were common. Children imitated adults, enacted scenes from religious narratives, or created elaborate adventures in courtyards, streets, or open fields. Through mimicry, they internalized societal roles, customs, and expectations. Education was informal yet pervasive. Boys and sometimes girls learned directly from parents, elders, or older siblings, absorbing knowledge about household management, craft, animal husbandry, and agriculture. Reading and writing, when taught, occurred under the guidance of scribes or in temple schools, where children learned to handle parchment, read pens and ink, copying texts that recorded law, history, or sacred poetry. Memorization played a central role. Young minds absorbed the cadence of prayers, the content of sacred stories, and moral lessons embedded in song or recitation. Learning was deeply intertwined with everyday life, reinforcing the connection between knowledge, survival, and faith. Festivals offered children moments of extraordinary delight. During communal celebrations, they ran through streets and courtyards, carried small flags, played miniature instruments, and joined adults in dancing or singing. Special treats were part of these occasions. Sweet cakes of honey, dried fruits, nuts, or pastries baked in clay ovens. Some festivals included games or contests for children, testing skill, strength, or cleverness, while storytellers captured their attention with fables that combined moral instruction with entertainment. Through these shared experiences, children learned the rhythms of society, the values of community, and the pleasures of shared joy. Childhood also involved apprenticeship in practical skills. A young boy might shadow his father in carpentry, observing the shaping of wood, learning the balance of hammer and chisel, and practicing small projects under careful supervision. A girl might weave simple mats or threads, gradually advancing to more intricate patterns. The process was incremental, patient, and guided by example rather than formal curriculum. Every task, whether fetching water, tending animals, or preparing simple meals, was an opportunity to internalize skills that would later define competence and independence. Animals were both companions and teachers. Children cared for small flocks of goats or sheep, learning to recognize illness, guide movement, and safeguard young animals. They discovered patience and responsibility as they attended to feeding, herding, and protection. Occasionally, they witnessed dangers, predators at the edges of fields, harsh weather, or accidents with animals. And these experiences, while frightening, imparted lessons in courage, observation, and quick decision-making. Meals were occasions for instruction and reflection as well. Children participated in preparing bread, grinding grain, stirring pots of lentils, or adding herbs to dishes, while elders explained the significance of ingredients, prayers, or seasonal observances. Eating was often communal, with children seated near parents or grandparents, sharing food and conversation, absorbing lessons in gratitude, moderation, and family cohesion. Even discipline carried moral and practical teachings, helping children understand societal expectations and ethical conduct. Nighttime offered both rest and reflection. Children slept on mats or platforms alongside siblings, sometimes under the stars on warm summer nights, listening to the sounds of family, animals, and distant streets. Elders might tell stories, recite prayers, or hum melodies, creating a soundscape that blended lullabies, history, and moral instruction. Sleep was never entirely undisturbed. Children awakened to sounds of movement, night animals, or household activity, learning attentiveness alongside rest. In these quiet hours, imagination flourished, dreams intertwined with stories, and memory consolidated the lessons of the day. Through play, work, learning, and observation, children absorbed the structure and spirit of their world. They witnessed craft, trade, ritual, and celebration, developing physical skills, moral understanding, social awareness, and emotional resilience. Childhood was both challenging and rich, a period of guided exploration where imagination met necessity, and where every experience, whether joyous or instructive, contributed to the formation of a capable, aware, and connected adult. In essence, the life of a child in biblical times was a continuous interplay of curiosity, duty, observation, and delight. Through daily chores, festive rituals, games, learning, and family interaction, they became attuned to the rhythms of nature, society, and the divine. Every laugh, every task, every moment of reflection or wonder was woven into the ongoing tapestry of life, shaping memory, identity, and the enduring human story. Religion in biblical times was not a separate domain from daily life. It infused every aspect of existence, shaping thought, behavior, and community cohesion. To step into the realm of worship was to witness a delicate balance of ritual, symbolism, and practical preparation, where human action and divine attention intertwined. Temples, altars, and sacred spaces were carefully maintained, each corner imbued with meaning, each object carrying purpose beyond mere appearance. Preparation for a religious observance began long before the public gathering. Families cleansed themselves, their homes, and sometimes even their garments, following prescribed rituals of purification. Water was drawn from wells or streams and used for washing hands, faces, or feet, symbolically aligning physical cleanliness with spiritual readiness. Certain foods were prepared according to custom, sometimes consecrated, sometimes reserved for offerings. Olive oil, grains, incense, and herbs were gathered, each item chosen with care, for these were not ordinary supplies. They were conduits for ritual, tangible expressions of devotion. When the time arrived to enter the temple or approach the altar, the senses were immediately engaged. The smell of burning incense or oil rose in gentle spirals. The sight of carefully arranged offerings reflected light and order, and the soft murmur of prayers or chants set the rhythm of participation. Priests, garbed in ceremonial robes often embroidered or decorated with symbolic colors, moved with precision, their actions choreographed and deliberate, ensuring that every gesture conformed to tradition. They lifted hands, waved objects, poured liquids, and recited words that had been repeated through generations, blending voice, motion, and intent into a living ritual. Sacrificial practices formed a central part of worship. Animals, lambs, goats, bulls, were prepared with care and attention. Their selection followed rules of age, health, and appearance, ensuring that the offering was acceptable and symbolic. Ritual killing was conducted with respect and precision, the act often accompanied by prayers, chants, and specific gestures intended to honor the divine. Blood, considered sacred, was handled with ritual purity, sometimes sprinkled upon altars or used in prescribed rites. Flesh was either consumed in communal meals or burned, depending on the type of sacrifice, each action carrying layers of meaning: thanksgiving, atonement, dedication, or petition. Offerings extended beyond animals. Grain, wine, oil, and incense were central to ritual observances. Flour might be baked into flat cakes, olive oil poured over fires, and aromatic herbs burned to create fragrant smoke. Each act was symbolic, creating a bridge between material labor and spiritual devotion, between human effort and divine acknowledgement. Even minor missteps could render an offering imperfect, reinforcing the importance of care, attentiveness, and understanding of tradition. Music and voice accompanied religious acts. Priests, musicians, or congregants played lyres, flutes, drums, or cymbals, while chanting or singing hymns structured the ceremony. The sounds were designed to focus attention, evoke awe, and unify participants in shared experience. Even the repetition of words carried power. Phrases memorized and recited collectively fostered cohesion, reinforced belief, and transmitted culture across generations. Children present in temples absorbed these rhythms, internalizing both form and meaning, learning devotion through immersion rather than formal instruction alone. Temples and altars themselves were centers of both ritual and community. Architecture conveyed status, symbolism, and hierarchy. Stone walls and steps defined sacred space, courtyards separated priests from lay people, and altars marked points of contact between mortal and divine. Objects such as chalices, incense burners, knives, and ceremonial garments were treated with care, cleaned, stored, and transported in ways that maintained both physical integrity and spiritual significance. Light from oil lamps flickered across walls, casting shadows that added drama, reverence, and a sense of presence. Preparation extended to mental and emotional states. Devotees approached ceremonies with humility, respect, and reflection. Prayers were whispered or recited aloud, sometimes for guidance, sometimes for gratitude, sometimes for atonement. The observant attended not only to external actions but to internal alignment. Thought, intent, and feeling were considered inseparable from physical deeds. To witness or participate in these rituals was to feel the weight of history, the continuity of practice, and the collective presence of those who had preceded and would follow. Festivals often amplified these practices. During major religious holidays, altars overflowed with offerings, music and chants persisted throughout the day, and processions wound through streets and courtyards, connecting temple, home, and market. Devotion extended beyond the temple walls. People brought gifts, shared meals, and reinforced social bonds through participation. Even mundane activities were imbued with sacred context, for ritual and daily life were interwoven threads of the same fabric. Ultimately, religious observance in biblical times was a lens through which all life was interpreted. Work, food, family, play, and community were continuously linked to devotion, remembrance, and aspiration. Ceremonies and sacrifices were not performances but acts of participation, engagement, and reflection, grounding individuals within a shared moral and spiritual universe. Through meticulous preparation, deliberate action, and attentive observation, communities expressed their values, honored ancestors, and sought connection with forces larger than themselves, creating a rhythm of life where the sacred and the ordinary existed in continual dialogue. Travel in biblical times was both necessity and adventure, a constant thread in the fabric of life that carried people across hills, deserts, rivers, and plains. Journeys could be brief, from village to market, or extended, spanning weeks or months, connecting distant lands through paths worn by footsteps, hooves, and wheels. The road was never merely a route. It was a space of learning, endurance, and observation, where humans and animals moved together in fragile harmony, and where every mile carried both promise and peril. Caravans were the primary vessels of long-distance commerce, moving in measured columns, often led by experienced guides familiar with terrain, water sources, and seasonal conditions. Camels, donkeys, and oxen bore heavy loads. Sacks of grain, jars of oil, bundles of cloth, crates of wine, spices in carefully wrapped containers, or fragile pottery. Merchants organized themselves into groups for mutual protection, for travelers faced hazards from bandits, wild animals, and sudden storms. Discipline and routine governed caravan life. Animals needed feeding, humans required rest, and the pace was dictated by the slowest or most vulnerable, ensuring survival through cooperation. Paths themselves were varied and often treacherous. Desert routes presented shifting sands, blistering heat, and scarce water, demanding precise planning. Hills and mountains tested endurance and skill, requiring careful navigation to avoid injury or loss. River crossings could be perilous, especially after rains, where currents surged and banks became unstable. Travelers learned to read signs in the landscape: the tracks of animals, the position of the sun, clouds that hinted at storms, vegetation indicating nearby water. Knowledge of the land was as essential as physical strength, and experienced guides were valued for their insight, intuition, and memory. Daily routines on the road were structured yet flexible. Early morning was for departure, often before sunrise to avoid the heat. Animals were harnessed, loads checked, and provisions distributed. Travelers carried food and water for themselves: bread, dried fruits, nuts, cheese, and small jugs of wine or water. Meals were simple, eaten in brief pauses, yet necessary for energy and morale. Midday often involved rest in shaded areas, tending animals, repairing loads, or adjusting clothing and footwear. Conversation, stories, and songs passed time, creating a rhythm that balanced labor with moments of communal connection. Encounters along the route enriched both experience and commerce. Villages offered supplies, inns provided shelter, and markets allowed trade or sale of surplus goods. Travelers exchanged news, learning of events in other regions, harvest successes, political developments, or natural calamities. Such interactions were vital, for information spread more reliably along well-traveled routes than through isolated communities. Travelers absorbed not only news but culture, dialects, and customs, creating networks of shared knowledge that spanned distance and time. Challenges were constant. Weather posed unpredictable threats. Rain could turn paths to mud, winds could strip tents or overturn carts, and extreme temperatures tested endurance. Bandits and thieves demanded vigilance. Travelers carried simple weapons or relied on numbers for protection. Illness or injury was a real concern, with limited medical knowledge available. Caravan life required resilience, adaptability, and cooperation, for survival depended on both individual competence and collective support. Evenings brought rest and ritual. Camps were arranged methodically. Animals tethered, fires lit for cooking and warmth, and humans settled on mats or blankets under the stars. Meals were shared communally, often supplemented by provisions from local villages. Stories and songs recounted previous travels, heroic deeds, or lessons from the land. Observing celestial patterns became part of orientation, for stars guided direction, marked seasons, and inspired reflection. Travelers developed habits of observation, patience, and rhythm, learning to measure time by sunlight, shadow, or celestial position. Trade itself shaped interactions. Merchants exchanged goods with locals along routes, negotiating for food, lodging, or new products to carry. Items often reflected the reach of commerce. Spices from distant deserts, pottery from urban centers, cloth dyed with rare colors, metals fashioned into tools or ornaments. Each transaction required knowledge of value, persuasion, and trust, teaching travelers not only survival but economic wisdom. Children and apprentices traveling with caravans learned through observation and participation. They tended animals, carried small loads, and absorbed the practical knowledge of roads, weather, and social interaction. Adolescents witnessed negotiation, navigation, and ritual observance, integrating lessons of patience, endurance, and adaptability into their own emerging identity. Travel was both education and endurance test, shaping character through experience rather than instruction alone. At its core, life on the road connected distant people and places, transmitting goods, culture, and ideas. Every mile traveled, every conversation, every challenge met contributed to a larger tapestry of civilization, where trade, observation, and endurance maintained the flow of life across space and time. The journey was never simply from one place to another. It was a moving classroom, a theater of human ingenuity and resilience, and a living link between home, market, temple, and distant lands, binding communities into networks of mutual reliance and shared history. The rhythm of daily life in villages and towns was defined not only by festivals, home, and travel, but also by the constant hum of work in workshops and by skilled hands shaping raw materials into objects of utility, beauty, and value. Craftsmanship was a vital thread in the tapestry of existence, linking the material to the cultural, the practical to the spiritual, and each artisan's labor to the broader community's survival and identity. Blacksmiths worked with fire, hammer, and metal, shaping tools, weapons, and household items with precision that demanded both strength and focus. The heat of the forge radiated through the workshop, mingling with the sharp tang of iron, sparks leaping as hammers struck heated metal. Apprentices learned to gauge temperature, timing, and technique, observing how the master moved, how rhythm and pressure affected the outcome, and how mistakes could be costly. Bellows puffed air to intensify flames, anvils rang with each measured blow, and tongs clutched glowing iron as it was bent, twisted, or joined. Each finished tool, a plowshare, a sickle, a knife, was essential, carrying both labor and intention into the world. Potters shaped clay with similar care and ritual. Hands, wet and steady, formed vessels on wheels or by hand, the clay spinning under fingertips, stretching into jars, bowls, or lamps. Firing in kilns required attention to temperature and timing. Too hot, and the vessel cracked; too cool, and it remained fragile. Potters sometimes inscribed symbols or patterns, embedding cultural meaning, blessings, or household markers into each object. The process was tactile, meditative, and precise, reflecting both practical skill and artistic sensibility. Weavers, spinners, and dyers transformed fibers into cloth, threading patience and pattern into every strand. Flax or wool was prepared, cleaned, and combed before being spun into thread on simple spindles or looms. Patterns and colors conveyed identity, status, or narrative. Dyes from plants, insects, or minerals required careful extraction and application. The mixing of colors was part art, part science. Women and men alike participated, passing knowledge across generations, ensuring that each weave carried both function and story. Cloth became clothing, sails, tent coverings, or ceremonial items, binding everyday life to craft. Builders and carpenters shaped the spaces where life unfolded. Wood, stone, and reeds were transformed into houses, tools, and furniture, demanding precision, measurement, and foresight. Hammers, chisels, saws, and mallets were in constant motion, their rhythmic impact echoing through streets and workshops. Construction involved collaboration, observation of natural forces, and knowledge of material properties, as well as the social skill to organize labor and maintain community trust. The work was physical, intellectual, and embedded with responsibility. A miscalculation could endanger both structure and lives. The interplay between craft, community, and ritual was continuous. Certain workshops had associations with sacred observances. Blacksmiths' hammers might echo the rhythm of ceremonial chants, potters' ovens might be lit in alignment with lunar cycles, and weavers might dedicate the first threads of a new cloth to divine favor. Objects themselves were sometimes consecrated or blessed before use. A tool to till the earth, a vessel to store wine, a garment to be worn in celebration, each carrying layers of meaning beyond its material purpose. Labor was never purely physical. It was intertwined with belief, memory, and intention. Children apprenticed in workshops, learning through touch, observation, and guided repetition. Small hands held hammers, molded clay, twisted fibers, or carried water for kilns and dyes. Learning was incremental, repeated, and absorbed through immersion rather than formal instruction. Mistakes were part of the process. Each error taught patience, adaptation, and the importance of concentration. The rhythm of craft life taught time management, anticipation, and coordination, as well as the subtle balance between speed and care, force and gentleness. Markets and trade connected craftsmen to the wider world. Finished objects, tools, pots, cloth, furniture, jewelry, traveled to urban centers, rural markets, or distant regions. Negotiation, display, and interaction with buyers added social and economic dimensions to craft, requiring artisans to understand value, taste, and communication. Each object carried labor, skill, and reputation, linking personal effort to communal economy and sustaining both families and networks of trade. Even in leisure, craft and observation intertwined. Artisans sometimes gathered in communal spaces to share techniques, demonstrate skill, or participate in competitions. Music, storytelling, and conversation interlaced with work, creating spaces where creativity, tradition, and social bonds reinforced one another. Craft life was continuous. From the flicker of morning light through the measured labor of day into the soft shadows of evening, hands, tools, and minds moved together, shaping both objects and the human experience. Through workshops and trade, communities survived, thrived, and connected. Every hammer strike, every spun thread, every vessel shaped by fire contributed to continuity and culture, embedding knowledge, skill, and identity in material form. Craftsmanship was a bridge between generations, a conduit for stories, morality, and survival. The rhythm of labor, attention, and ritual formed a continuous pattern, linking the ordinary to the extraordinary, embedding human presence in both the tangible and intangible world. Life in biblical communities was never solitary. It was a web of relationships, woven through family, friendship, neighborhood, and extended networks that created both security and complexity. From early morning chores to evening gatherings, interactions shaped identity, reinforced values, and determined survival, blending affection, obligation, and societal expectation into a continuous rhythm that defined existence. Neighbors were crucial, often the first line of support in daily life. Courtyards, streets, and markets became spaces of shared knowledge, assistance, and observation. Children played together under the watchful eyes of adults, learning manners, cooperation, and the delicate balance of competition and camaraderie. Women often collaborated in tasks such as grinding grain, weaving, or baking bread, sharing both labor and conversation. Men might assist each other in tending flocks, repairing homes, or constructing tools, with humor, advice, and storytelling interspersed throughout work. In these exchanges, trust and reputation were earned and maintained, as the proximity of daily life made cooperation essential and oversight continuous. Friendship extended beyond immediate neighbors. Traveling merchants, artisans, and pilgrims encountered others on roads or at markets, forming temporary alliances or enduring bonds. Gifts, shared meals, or guidance offered to travelers reinforced networks of reciprocity that spanned distances. Stories of loyalty, ingenuity, or courage spread quickly, weaving individuals into communal memory and offering models of behavior. Even brief encounters could leave lasting impressions, shaping expectations for conduct, generosity, and vigilance. Love and family were central to human connection, though framed by custom and tradition. Marriage was both a personal and communal institution, linking households, clans, and social networks. Partnerships were guided by negotiation, practical considerations, and social alignment, yet affection, attraction, and companionship flourished within these structures. Couples shared labor, meals, and ritual, observing cycles of work and worship together, creating routines that intertwined survival, devotion, and intimacy. Parenting was deeply embedded in daily labor. Children observed, assisted, and absorbed both practical skills and moral lessons. Emotional bonds were reinforced through stories, songs, and shared experiences, embedding memory and culture in a living lineage. Conflict was inevitable, as human desires, misunderstandings, and competition intersected. Disputes arose over land boundaries, resources, debts, or social grievances, and communities relied on a mix of negotiation, tradition, and leadership to restore balance. Elders often mediated, drawing upon collective memory, religious precepts, and moral codes to adjudicate disputes. Punishments, when necessary, ranged from restitution and public acknowledgement to isolation or labor duties, always aiming to repair social harmony and reinforce shared norms. The careful balance of justice, mercy, and social expectation was a constant undercurrent, teaching individuals how to navigate both personal ambition and communal responsibility. Rituals and moral instruction were embedded in relationships, shaping interactions subtly and persistently. Greetings, gestures of respect, hospitality to strangers, and deference to elders were observed and internalized, not merely as formality but as vital social glue. Celebrations, births, weddings, harvest festivals, and religious observances offered opportunities to reaffirm bonds, display skill or wealth, and participate in collective joy. Music, dance, shared meals, and storytelling reinforced cohesion, while also providing venues for subtle negotiation of status, loyalty, and influence. Observation and imitation were fundamental in learning social conduct. Children mirrored adults in speech, gesture, and ritual, internalizing lessons on generosity, patience, courage, and honor. Mistakes prompted guidance, correction, and storytelling, where elders recounted examples from history, scripture, or local memory, demonstrating consequences and rewards of action. Social memory functioned as both teacher and warning, embedding communal norms into daily behavior without formal instruction. Hospitality formed a key dimension of relational life. Travelers, merchants, or distant relatives were welcomed into homes, offered food, drink, and sleeping space, and treated with respect to honor tradition and reinforce social bonds. The act of receiving guests carried moral weight, conveying virtue, generosity, and connection to divine expectation. Similarly, visiting and assisting neighbors reinforced interdependence, ensuring that both individual needs and communal survival were acknowledged and supported. Romance and courtship existed alongside practical considerations, developing through observation, conversation, shared work, and public gatherings. Songs, poetry, or symbolic gestures were often used to communicate interest, express emotion, or convey subtle messages of intention. Social rituals and community oversight guided these interactions, balancing personal desire with family approval, societal expectation, and religious precept. Emotional connection, though entwined with practicality, flourished within this structured freedom. Through daily interaction, communities developed patterns of loyalty, caution, generosity, and empathy. Every conversation, shared meal, gesture, or dispute contributed to a living tapestry of human connection, reinforcing the bonds that allowed survival and continuity. Moral codes and tradition acted as invisible frameworks, guiding behavior, resolving tension, and embedding values in routine action. Life was thus both ordinary and intricate, a continuous negotiation between individual impulse and communal expectation, where survival, learning, and devotion intertwined seamlessly. Life in biblical villages revolved around the land, for agriculture was both sustenance and culture, binding communities to the rhythm of seasons, the whims of weather, and the persistent labor of human hands. From the moment dawn light spilled over fields and hills, the sounds of work echoed. The rhythmic strike of hoes, the scrape of plows against soil, the clatter of tools being prepared for another day of tending crops. Men, women, and children each played a role, their labor choreographed by necessity, tradition, and intimate knowledge of the land's temperament. Fields were cultivated with care, using tools crafted by local blacksmiths or carpenters. Wooden plows tipped with metal, sickles curved to slice grain, hoes and spades for breaking earth, and baskets woven from reeds for gathering. Before planting, land was inspected, weeds removed, and soil turned and aerated, often accompanied by prayers or invocations asking for fertility and protection from drought, pests, or disease. The process demanded both physical exertion and observation, as the timing of each action affected the quality and quantity of the harvest. Planting was a communal effort. Grains like wheat and barley, legumes and vegetables were sown by hand, seeds scattered evenly across furrows, pressed gently into the soil, and covered with care. Families worked together, sometimes joined by neighbors, blending efficiency with social interaction. Women might carry water to moisten soil, children might help by holding small bundles of seeds, and men might guide plows drawn by oxen or donkeys, ensuring straight lines and proper depth. The choreography of planting balanced strength, dexterity, and attentiveness, embedding lessons in cooperation and rhythm. Irrigation was another crucial task. Canals, channels, and reservoirs were managed to ensure water reached crops efficiently. Water was drawn from wells, rivers, or seasonal rainfall, distributed across fields and monitored carefully, for too much or too little could ruin months of effort. Observation of clouds, wind, soil moisture, and the behavior of plants informed every action, blending practical skill with an awareness of natural patterns. Even in routine watering, farmers learned patience, foresight, and respect for forces beyond their control. Harvest was both culmination and celebration. Fields turned golden under the sun, and the air filled with the sense of ripe grain, fresh herbs, and gathered produce. Men and women wielded sickles with practiced skill, cutting stalks of wheat or barley, while children carried bundles or collected fallen grain. The work was exhausting, yet exhilarating. The promise of sustenance and survival infused effort with meaning. Grain was gathered, threshed, and winnowed, separating kernels from chaff. Olives were pressed for oil, grapes crushed for wine. Each step demanded precision, care, and knowledge passed down through generations. Meals in agricultural communities reflected the cycles of work and harvest. Bread, cooked over clay ovens, was often the centerpiece, accompanied by lentils, vegetables, fruit, and occasionally meat. Families and workers shared food communally, replenishing energy while strengthening bonds. The timing of meals aligned with labor. Early morning bread and water before fieldwork, midday pauses under shade for bread, cheese, and figs, and evening meals where stories, songs, and conversation provided rest and reflection. Food was nourishment, ritual, and social glue simultaneously. Seasonal and ritual observances punctuated agricultural life. Festivals marked sowing, harvest, and fertility, blending work with devotion. Offerings of first fruits were brought to temple or altar, gifts of grain, fruit, or wine acknowledging divine favor and seeking continued abundance. Music, dance, and storytelling accompanied communal labor and celebration, intertwining entertainment, reflection, and moral instruction. Children learned not only the mechanics of agriculture but the spiritual and social meaning embedded in every action. Labor extended beyond fields to animal husbandry. Sheep, goats, and cattle required daily attention, feeding, herding, milking, and safeguarding against predators. The routines of grazing and care mirrored crop cycles, teaching observation, timing, and responsibility. Herding was both practical and educational, instilling patience, vigilance, and coordination, while also allowing for storytelling, songs, and lessons passed from elders to children. Through toil, observation, ritual, and shared meals, agricultural communities created continuity between human effort and natural cycles. Knowledge of soil, weather, plants, and animals was both empirical and inherited, forming a tapestry of survival skills intertwined with cultural memory. Life on the land was never passive. It required engagement, endurance, and understanding, shaping bodies, minds, and relationships, and embedding every member of the community into a web of interdependence where labor, sustenance, devotion, and social cohesion were inseparable. Waterways were vital arteries of life, commerce, and culture in biblical times, connecting communities, facilitating trade, and offering both sustenance and adventure. Rivers, lakes, and coastal shores were not simply landscapes. They were stages for labor, observation, and human ingenuity, shaping rhythm, movement, and interaction. Life on water required skill, patience, and attentiveness, for even calm waters could conceal danger, and even brief journeys demanded respect for nature's caprice. Fishing was one of the primary occupations tied to water. Small boats, often made of wood planks bound together and sometimes sealed with pitch or clay, floated on rivers or along coastal waters. Nets of various sizes were meticulously woven from flax or other fibers, their knots tied with care to ensure strength and durability. Fishermen worked at dawn, launching boats quietly to avoid spooking fish, the gentle splash of oars mingling with the early cries of birds. Nets were cast, drawn, and checked, sometimes carrying the catch to market, sometimes consumed within the household, and occasionally offered as part of religious tribute or festival. The techniques of fishing were diverse and often shared across generations. Line fishing, trap setting, and net casting each demanded observation of tides, currents, and animal behavior. Fish were studied. Their habits, preferred waters, and seasonal patterns informed strategy. Apprentices learned by watching elders, gradually understanding the interplay of strength, timing, patience, and intuition. Beyond sustenance, fishing was a lens into the natural world, teaching respect, rhythm, and attentiveness. Travel by water extended beyond fishing. Merchants and pilgrims utilized rivers and coastal routes to transport goods over long distances, sometimes faster and safer than overland travel. Boats were loaded with jars of wine, sacks of grain, textiles, and crafted items, carefully balanced to prevent capsizing. Crew members coordinated movements. Oars dipped in unison, sails adjusted to catch wind, and watch was maintained for rocks, currents, or sudden weather changes. The work required discipline, trust, and constant attention, as errors could result in loss of cargo, injury, or delay. Waterways were also sites of observation, learning, and reflection. Children traveling with adults watched the rise and fall of tides, the behavior of birds and fish, and the changing colors of water under the sun. Stories and songs were exchanged, recounting heroic journeys, divine intervention, or the consequences of carelessness. These oral traditions conveyed practical knowledge, moral instruction, and cultural memory simultaneously, embedding lessons in both heart and mind. Communities along rivers and coasts developed rituals tied to water. Offerings might be placed near riverbanks or shorelines, prayers recited before setting out on journeys, and specific days marked for blessing boats, nets, or the first catch of the season. Water itself was sometimes symbolic in ceremonial acts, representing purification, sustenance, and the flow of life. Festivals celebrated abundance, successful harvests of fish, or safe returns from voyages, blending labor, devotion, and community celebration. Daily life on the shore balanced work with leisure. Children played in shallow waters, learning to swim, wade, or handle small boats, while observing elders. Women washed garments or prepared food, sometimes in communal areas, sharing conversation and practical instruction. Men repaired nets, maintained boats, or coordinated travel, passing down knowledge in practical, observable ways. Meals often included fish, bread, legumes, and fruits, accompanied by water or wine, consumed collectively to strengthen bonds and provide sustenance after exertion. Evenings on water carried quiet reflection and vigilance. Fires on shore illuminated campsites, while oars rested, nets dried, and conversations drifted into song or storytelling. Observing the stars became essential for navigation and orientation, connecting travel to celestial rhythm, seasonal awareness, and cultural memory. Sleep was intermittent during extended journeys, punctuated by watch rotations, the gentle rocking of boats, and the soft sounds of flowing water, embedding rhythm and attentiveness into consciousness. Through labor, observation, and ritual, waterways shaped both community and individual. The flow of rivers, the movement of tides, and the behavior of fish dictated schedules, labor intensity, and social interaction. Travel by boat connected distant regions, facilitated trade, and reinforced cultural links, while fishing provided both nourishment and instruction. Water became a teacher, a conduit of continuity, and a framework for devotion, embedding practical, social, and spiritual knowledge into daily life. The intertwined experience of labor, observation, ritual, and navigation created patterns of thought, skill, and reflection. Each journey, each catch, each voyage reinforced patience, cooperation, and respect for forces larger than humans, blending survival, community, and belief into a seamless narrative where water was both livelihood and metaphor, stage and teacher, challenge and sustenance. Trade was the lifeblood connecting villages, towns, and distant regions, a network of exchange that shaped not only the economy but social relations, knowledge, and culture. Markets were more than spaces of commerce. They were arenas of human interaction, negotiation, observation, and subtle performance, where skill, reputation, and timing determined both survival and prosperity. Life in and around markets pulsed with rhythm. The clatter of carts on cobblestones, the hum of conversation, the calls of merchants proclaiming goods, and the sense of spices, bread, herbs, and fresh produce mingling in the air. Local markets were organized with unspoken rules and social customs. Stalls and spaces were assigned or claimed, sometimes regulated by town authorities, sometimes maintained through tradition and reputation. Merchants displayed goods with care. Textiles folded or hung to show color and texture, pottery stacked to avoid breakage yet demonstrate craftsmanship, grains, fruits, and vegetables arranged to highlight freshness. Buyers and sellers engaged in ritualized negotiation, balancing persuasion, observation, and patience. A well-timed gesture, an informed question, or a keen eye could secure favorable exchange, while misjudgment could result in loss of resources or status. Long-distance trade relied on caravans moving overland or via waterways, connecting distant regions with goods, ideas, and cultural practices. Merchants coordinated logistics carefully, considering routes, timing, and protection against hazards. Camels, donkeys, and oxen carried jars of oil, wine, spices, cloth, metals, and crafted items. Cooperation was essential. Each member of a caravan had responsibilities, from maintaining animals and cargo to navigation and negotiation with local authorities. Knowledge of geography, weather, customs, and politics was indispensable. A miscalculation could delay travel, endanger cargo, or strain relationships with communities along the route. Valuable commodities had both economic and symbolic significance. Spices such as cinnamon, frankincense, and myrrh were rare, transported with care and often reserved for ceremonial use or exchange among elites. Textiles dyed with indigo or crimson, precious metals, and crafted ornaments carried aesthetic and social meaning, reinforcing status and demonstrating skill. Everyday goods, grain, oil, wine, pottery, sustained life, but even these were embedded in cultural and ritual significance, forming part of cycles of offering, celebration, and reciprocity. Currency was often in the form of silver, weighed and measured for precision, though barter remained common, particularly in rural areas or for small-scale transactions. Transactions relied on trust, skill in assessment, and knowledge of standards. Merchants carried scales, weights, and measuring vessels, while buyers assessed quality through touch, sight, or even taste. Social skill, reputation, and negotiation were as important as physical goods, embedding commerce in human relationships as much as in material exchange. Markets were also centers of communication. News traveled along trade routes, transmitted by word of mouth, observation, or formal announcement. Travelers carried information about weather, political developments, crop yields, or social events, blending commerce with intelligence gathering. Markets became hubs of both material and informational exchange, sustaining not only economic life but communal awareness, memory, and planning. Festivals and religious observances often intersected with trade. Offerings, first fruits, or ceremonial items were sold or exchanged, connecting economic activity with ritual and devotion. Merchants timed journeys to coincide with festivals, maximizing opportunity for profit and interaction. The exchange of goods and services thus reinforced cycles of labor, celebration, and social cohesion, intertwining material necessity with moral and spiritual expectation. Social regulation underpinned trade. Elders, town leaders, or religious authorities maintained norms, adjudicated disputes, and monitored fairness. Cheating, fraud, or overcharging could damage reputation, disrupt networks, or invite sanction. Conversely, honesty, skill, and generosity fostered trust, repeat business, and long-term prosperity. Trade was both practical and ethical, a space where human intelligence, observation, and morality intersected with survival and success. Children and apprentices observed trade keenly, learning through participation and imitation. They carried goods, assisted in negotiations, or watched the careful assessment of quality and weight. Storytelling and guidance reinforced understanding, embedding economic literacy alongside social and moral awareness. Market life was thus both education and survival, shaping perception, skill, and behavior across generations. In essence, trade was the circulatory system of society, moving goods, ideas, knowledge, and culture through space and time. Each transaction, caravan journey, or market interaction linked individual labor to collective prosperity, practical skill to social reputation, and material necessity to cultural and ritual expression. Through observation, negotiation, and participation, communities sustained life, transmitted knowledge, and reinforced networks of interdependence, weaving commerce seamlessly into the fabric of daily and spiritual existence. Festivals and celebrations punctuated the rhythm of life, transforming ordinary days into moments of communal gathering, ritual observance, and joyous expression. These events, tied to agricultural cycles, religious observances, or historical remembrance, created structure and meaning, offering both pause and reflection amid the labor, travel, and daily obligations that occupied communities. Life during festivals was vivid, sensory, and immersive, blending devotion, entertainment, and sustenance into a seamless experience that engaged body, mind, and spirit. Preparation for a festival began days or even weeks in advance. Families cleaned and repaired homes, prepared food in abundance, and created decorations or symbols marking the occasion. Streets and courtyards might be swept and adorned with greenery, flowers, or banners crafted from dyed cloth. Artisans and traders contributed goods, tools, or materials, connecting the economic cycle to cultural life. Kitchens were bustling with activity. Bread baked in large quantities, lentils, grains, and vegetables prepared, wine pressed and stored, and special dishes set aside for ceremonial meals. The sense of cooking mingled with smoke from ritual fires, creating an atmosphere that signaled both anticipation and sacred participation. Music and sound were central to festival experience. Drums, flutes, lyres, and other instruments provided rhythm and melody for dances, processions, and performances. Singing, both communal and solo, reinforced collective memory, retelling historical, religious, or legendary narratives that anchored the celebration. Children learned songs and rhythms from elders, participating actively and internalizing cultural knowledge through practice and repetition. The auditory landscape of a festival, voices, instruments, footsteps, and laughter, created a sense of cohesion, excitement, and continuity. Rituals varied depending on the occasion. Offerings, prayers, and symbolic acts were performed to honor deities, express gratitude, or mark transitions in agricultural or life cycles. Some rituals involved the first fruits of harvest, water or fire as purifying elements, or the enactment of historical events. Participation was often communal. Families, neighbors, and travelers joined, each fulfilling roles that reinforced social bonds and cultural norms. Observing and performing these rituals instilled a sense of order, respect, and connection to forces larger than individual existence. Entertainment was woven into festivals, balancing devotion with amusement. Storytelling recounted heroic deeds, moral lessons, or divine interventions, captivating audiences of all ages. Games and contests tested skill, strength, and strategy, encouraging participation while reinforcing social hierarchy and cooperation. Children ran and played, mimicking adult tasks or engaging in playful challenges, learning through imitation and observation. Dance, often coordinated with music, became both expression and teaching. Steps, patterns, and formations conveyed cultural meaning and created shared memory. Meals during festivals were abundant and diverse. Bread, grains, legumes, fruits, vegetables, and occasionally meat were prepared and shared communally. Special dishes reflected both the season and symbolic meaning, reinforcing agricultural cycles, divine favor, and community cohesion. Sharing food was both practical and ritualistic, reinforcing ties between households, generations, and social groups. Eating together in these contexts extended beyond nourishment. It was an act of solidarity, memory, and cultural reinforcement. Markets and trade were also influenced by festivals. Merchants brought rare goods, decorative items, or specialty foods to towns and villages, capitalizing on increased demand while contributing to communal abundance. Festivals stimulated exchange, not merely for profit, but to reinforce social and cultural networks, ensuring that artisans, traders, and consumers participated collectively in both economy and tradition. Knowledge of timing, quality, and social etiquette became crucial, linking economic skill to cultural awareness. Evening brought another layer of experience. Fires glowed in courtyards, casting flickering shadows across walls and faces, while conversation, song, and reflection intertwined with fatigue and satisfaction. The day's intensity, physical and emotional, dissolved into a slower rhythm of contemplation, storytelling, and rest. Observing stars and moonlight offered a cosmic frame for human celebration, connecting the temporal joy of festivals with cycles of nature, season, and belief. Festivals were thus multidimensional. They combined labor, ritual, entertainment, sustenance, learning, and social cohesion. Through observation, participation, and repetition, communities preserved tradition, reinforced morality, and celebrated existence. The sensory experience, sound, sight, touch, taste, and smell, interwove with memory, skill, and emotion, creating enduring patterns that shaped individuals and collective identity alike. Every festival, regardless of scale or location, became a microcosm of life itself. Labor and leisure, devotion and celebration, individuality and community, all entwined seamlessly in the ongoing story of human experience. Religious practice permeated every facet of life, shaping behavior, decisions, and communal structures, embedding morality and devotion into the daily rhythm of existence. Temples, shrines, and altars were centers not merely of worship, but of learning, law, and social cohesion, where divine expectation intertwined with practical guidance and cultural memory. The sounds, scents, and gestures of devotion formed a continuous backdrop, guiding both thought and action, teaching reverence, patience, and attentiveness from childhood onward. Daily prayers structured individual and family life. Morning prayers greeted the day, invoking protection, guidance, and gratitude. Midday prayers marked labor's midpoint, offering reflection, pause, and moral recalibration. Evening prayers concluded the day, thanking deities, seeking forgiveness, and preparing hearts and minds for rest. Words were recited aloud, whispered, or sung, with gestures such as bowing, kneeling, or raising hands reinforcing mindfulness and embodiment of faith. Children learned by observation and repetition, internalizing both the rhythm and meaning of devotion gradually, often before fully understanding theological principles. Sacrificial rituals were central, whether simple offerings of food, wine, or incense at home altars, or formal animal sacrifices at temples. The preparation was precise. Animals were selected with care, food offerings measured, and ritual objects arranged meticulously. The act itself required attention to detail, timing, and prescribed gestures, symbolizing both obedience and participation in a sacred order. Observers and participants alike understood that the offering was more than material. It was communication, acknowledgement of divine presence, and reinforcement of communal identity. Temples and shrines were both physical and symbolic focal points. Architecture and decoration reflected aesthetic, spiritual, and functional priorities. Stone, wood, and metal were combined to create spaces of beauty, permanence, and sanctity. Courtyards, inner chambers, and altars were arranged for processions, rituals, and instruction, providing both order and inspiration. Daily life often intersected with temple activities. Craftsmen maintained structures, Priests performed rituals and pilgrims or local worshippers attended, bringing news, offerings, and social interaction, reinforcing the link between material culture and spiritual practice. Instruction and moral guidance were inseparable from ritual. Elders, priests, and teachers conveyed precepts orally and through demonstration, ensuring that ethical principles, honesty, justice, generosity, humility, were internalized alongside devotion. Stories of historical events, divine intervention, and exemplary individuals illustrated moral consequences, blending narrative, reflection, and practical wisdom. Learning was experiential. Observing rituals, participating in offerings, assisting in temple duties, and engaging in discussion created holistic understanding grounded in daily life. Observances and festivals amplified religious practice, integrating ritual with community, labor, and celebration. Pilgrimages to sacred sites combined physical exertion, social interaction, and spiritual reflection. Processions, chants, music, and offerings synchronized collective attention, creating immersive experiences that reinforced shared values. Children and novices were included in these activities, witnessing the interplay of devotion, celebration, and social order, absorbing patterns of behavior, timing, and ethical reflection that structured communal life. Even mundane tasks were infused with ritual significance. Food preparation, cleaning, weaving, and tending animals were often accompanied by prayers, blessings, or symbolic gestures. Labor became devotion, repetition became meditation, and observation became instruction. The ordinary and extraordinary intertwined seamlessly, ensuring that every aspect of life reinforced awareness of divine presence and moral responsibility. Hospitality and charity were extensions of religious practice. Travelers and the needy were welcomed and provided for, reflecting both social expectation and spiritual principle. Acts of generosity and assistance were public and private, reinforcing social bonds, establishing reputation, and embedding ethical behavior in practical action. The intertwining of devotion, observation, and ethical practice created a lived morality that was inseparable from daily survival and community life. Through these practices, individuals and communities developed rhythm, awareness, and resilience. Daily prayers, offerings, participation in temple life, and observation of ritual created continuity across generations. Life became a continuous negotiation between practical needs and spiritual aspiration, where devotion, morality, and communal cohesion were inseparable. Each gesture, word, and action, repeated and observed, wove human experience into the enduring fabric of faith, culture, and daily existence, linking past, present, and future in a seamless narrative of life under divine guidance. Education was an intrinsic part of community life, though it differed greatly from modern formal schooling. Learning occurred through observation, imitation, repetition, and guided practice, blending practical skill, moral instruction, and cultural memory into daily routines. From the youngest age, children were immersed in tasks, rituals, and responsibilities that simultaneously taught survival, social norms, and spiritual principles, creating a holistic educational environment that extended across years and generations. Apprenticeship was central to skill acquisition. Young people learned trades such as carpentry, pottery, weaving, and metalworking by working alongside experienced artisans. Tools were carefully handled, materials inspected, and techniques demonstrated repeatedly until competence was internalized. Mistakes were corrected gently but firmly, often accompanied by explanation or anecdote illustrating the consequences of error and the benefits of precision. Over time, apprentices gained not only skill, but also an understanding of rhythm, patience, and problem-solving essential to mastery. Writing and literacy, though less widespread, were valued in certain contexts such as temples, marketplaces, and administrative centers. Children exposed to writing observed elders inscribing records, letters, or religious texts, gradually learning shapes, symbols, and techniques. Scribes instructed novices in copying texts accurately, memorizing sequences, and understanding meaning, linking literacy to memory, devotion, and practical necessity. Writing was a tool for communication, record-keeping, and cultural continuity, ensuring that knowledge survived beyond the lifespan of individuals. Numeracy was equally practical and pervasive. Counting, measuring, and calculation were integral to trade, agriculture, and ritual. Children learned to tally grains, weigh silver, measure fabric, and divide portions accurately. Games, storytelling, and hands-on tasks often reinforced arithmetic concepts, making learning engaging and contextually relevant. Competence in numbers was both a survival skill and a marker of reliability and status, intertwined with social trust and economic activity. Cultural education was transmitted orally and experientially. Elders, parents, and teachers conveyed history, legends, proverbs, and moral lessons through stories, songs, and performance. Children internalized communal memory, understanding both practical consequences and ethical dimensions of behavior. Observing rituals, participating in festivals, and assisting in household or public duties offered immersive instruction, reinforcing values of honesty, courage, generosity, and respect. Learning was continuous and context-rich, blending entertainment, reflection, and instruction seamlessly. Religious education intertwined with moral and civic instruction. Participation in prayer, offerings, and temple duties taught attention, discipline, and ethical reflection. Stories of divine intervention, law-giving, and exemplary behavior illustrated principles, consequences, and virtues, providing both caution and inspiration. Children and adults alike engaged with these lessons through observation, enactment, and discussion, ensuring that spiritual awareness complemented practical knowledge. Travel and trade further expanded educational opportunities. Children accompanying parents to markets or rivers observed negotiation, measurement, and the evaluation of goods. Pilgrims, travelers, and merchants shared stories, knowledge of distant lands, and practical techniques, exposing communities to broader perspectives. Learning in these contexts reinforced adaptability, critical thinking, and cultural awareness, linking local skill with regional or even transregional knowledge. Social norms and behavioral education were woven into daily life. Politeness, respect for elders, honesty, and communal responsibility were reinforced by observation, correction, and reward. Children were taught to cooperate, negotiate, and resolve disputes through example and guided practice. Moral and social instruction was thus inseparable from practical engagement, ensuring that education encompassed mind, body, and character simultaneously. Leisure and play were also educational. Games, contests, and playful mimicry allowed children to practice coordination, strategy, and social skills. Music, song, and dance offered memory, rhythm, and cultural transmission, while storytelling conveyed history, morality, and entertainment. Play was thus both recreation and structured learning, a subtle but essential thread in the fabric of experience. Ultimately, education in biblical communities was immersive, continuous, and holistic. Every task, observation, ritual, and interaction contributed to skill, morality, and cultural continuity. Children and adults alike participated in an ongoing process where practical, spiritual, and social knowledge were inseparable, ensuring that each generation could navigate survival, devotion, and community life successfully, while sustaining the collective memory and wisdom of the past.